Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. Have you ever wondered if history watches us, silently judging our every step, as if it knows the pattern of our mistakes, the echoes of our suffering? That was the question I couldn't shake off as I stood in front of the colossal statue. It was as if time had bent itself around this silent figure, trapping me in its shadow. It was just supposed to be another stop on my journey, a fleeting moment in an otherwise unremarkable day. But something in the air shifted as I walked through the foggy ruins. Something that made my skin tingle, as though the earth beneath me was breathing in sync with my heartbeat. The statue stood at the center of the abandoned square, a towering figure carved from stone, its features worn by centuries of neglect. Yet, despite the weathering, there was an undeniable strength to its presence. Its eyes, cold, unfeeling, fixed straight ahead, seemed to pierce the very fabric of the air, as though daring anyone to meet its gaze. The square around it was empty, save for the overgrown weeds that threatened to swallow the cobblestones. A few crumbling buildings loomed nearby, their walls cracked and weather-beaten, whispering the secrets of a past long forgotten. I had been walking for hours, taking in the eerie silence, the occasional rustle of leaves carried by the wind, and yet something felt wrong. The silence wasn't natural, it was heavy, suffocating. It clung to the air like a weight, pushing against me as I moved. I approached the statue, my feet dragging across the uneven ground. There was something about its gaze that unsettled me, something that made my chest tighten. I was used to old monuments, the remnants of civilizations long past, but this was different. The sheer stillness of it, the unblinking stare, made it feel alive in a way that nothing should. As I drew closer, the smell hit me. It was faint at first, just a whiff on the breeze, but unmistakable. Rot. A smell of decay that seemed to rise from the earth itself. I stopped, my senses on high alert. I looked around, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing. Just the silent emptiness of the ruins. The smell was only growing stronger now, as if the very stone itself was exhaling it. My breath hitched, and I took a step back, but my feet wouldn't move as swiftly as I wanted them to. It was as if the ground beneath me had grown heavier, each step harder to take. I couldn't explain it. There was a tension in the air that made it feel as if the world had paused, waiting for something, anything, to happen. The quiet was oppressive, suffocating. And yet, the statue stood there, unmoving, its gaze still fixed on something only it could see. I forced myself to look away from its eyes, my pulse quickening as I scanned the area. The wind had stopped. The rustling of the leaves had died. There was no sound now, nothing but the pounding of my own heart in my ears. It's just the silence playing tricks on me, I thought. This place is old. Too old. Maybe it's just the weight of history pressing down on me. I turned, about to leave, but something stopped me. A sound. A soft whisper, almost imperceptible. It was too faint to make out, but it was there. It came from the direction of the statue, a voice that seemed to speak without moving its lips. A breathless hiss that made the hair on my neck stand on end. I tried to tell myself it was the wind, but the wind didn't whisper. I looked back at the statue. Nothing had changed. It was still staring ahead, still unmoving, but somehow it felt different. It felt like it was waiting. My feet shuffled, almost of their own accord, taking me closer to it. The smell of decay was overwhelming now, suffocating in its intensity. My head felt heavy, my thoughts clouded. I reached out, my fingers brushing the stone, the surface cold and smooth beneath my touch. And then it happened. The ground trembled. A faint vibration that began in my feet, crawling up my legs, making my knees buckle. The statue's eyes, cold and unblinking, seemed to gleam in the dim light, and I felt a sudden rush of dread. I wasn't alone. The whisper came again, louder this time. A voice that was at once distant and close, like it was inside my head. It was barely a sound, but it felt like a command. Look deeper. I froze. My heart skipped a beat, and a chill ran through my spine. My hand was still pressed against the statue, and I could feel something under the stone. A faint pulse, like the beating of a heart. But it wasn't the statue that was alive. It was the ground beneath me. The earth itself seemed to stir, shifting with an unnatural heaviness. The air grew thicker, heavier. And the whisper, that terrible whisper, began to grow louder. It wasn't a voice anymore. It was a sound that filled my head, echoing through my thoughts, filling every corner of my mind. Look deeper. You must see the truth. I pulled my hand away from the stone, stumbling back, my breath coming in short gasps. But it wasn't enough. The ground was shifting beneath me, pulling me closer to the statue, as if the very earth was eager to swallow me whole. I could hear it now, the deep thrum of something ancient, something powerful, buried beneath the surface. The statue's cold, lifeless gaze followed my every movement. And I knew then, I wasn't just a visitor here. I was part of something much older, something far more terrifying than I could ever understand. The cycle has begun. The realization hit me like a hammer. The statue wasn't just a monument. It was a marker, a symbol of something that had existed long before me and would continue long after I was gone. It was waiting for me to understand. Waiting for me to see. And somewhere, deep in the bowels of the earth, something ancient, something monstrous, stirred. The cycle had begun again. I don't know how long I stood there, rooted to the spot. The world around me had shifted, my senses were overloaded, my mind scrambling to make sense of what was happening. The whispering had stopped, but the feeling of being watched, of something looming just beyond the edge of my perception, was suffocating. I took a step back, then another. But each movement felt like I was moving through thick mud, as if the earth itself was reluctant to let me go. My head swam with dizziness, and I had to focus on breathing, slow, steady inhales that barely seemed to reach my lungs. But there was something more pressing. Something I couldn't ignore. The statue. It had always been there, standing in the center of the square, its towering form a silent observer. But now, it felt different. More alive, somehow. Its gaze seemed to follow me, not with a dull, passive stare of stone, but with an intensity that made my stomach churn. The longer I looked at it, the more I felt like I was being pulled into its gaze, like it was reaching out to me, beckoning me to uncover whatever dark secret it had been guarding for centuries. I turned away. I shouldn't have looked back, but I did. I couldn't stop myself. The impulse to understand, to know, was too strong. And as I faced the statue again, my breath caught in my throat. The face had changed. At first, it was subtle, almost imperceptible, but there it was, in the curve of the mouth, the slight deepening of the eyes. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make my skin crawl. The stone wasn't just withered anymore, it had shifted, as if reacting to something buried deep within. I stumbled backward, almost falling into the weeds that had overrun the cobblestone path. My pulse was racing, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The statue wasn't the same. It was alive, in some way I couldn't comprehend. The truth of it clung to me like a shadow, choking the air out of my lungs. It wasn't supposed to move. It couldn't. But what if it wasn't just the statue that was alive? What if the very place was cursed? The ground beneath my feet, the air, what if it was all part of something much larger, something older than I had ever imagined? A scream bubbled up in my throat, but I pressed my hand to my mouth to hold it in. I was alone here. But that didn't matter. It felt as if the land itself was watching me now, as if the trees, the ruined buildings, even the very wind itself had eyes. I turned and ran. My feet pounded against the uneven ground, the noise of my steps deafening in the unnerving silence. My heart hammered in my chest as I sprinted toward the edge of the square. But when I reached the gate, what I thought was the exit, I froze. It was gone. The gate, the path that should have led me out of this place, had disappeared. Where once it had been, there was nothing but thick, tangled vegetation, like the land itself had swallowed it whole. I pressed my hands against the stone walls, desperately searching for any sign of the way out. But it was like the square had transformed into a labyrinth, the entrance sealed off by an invisible force. I spun around, panic clawing at my chest. I had to leave. I had to escape. But there was nowhere to go. I could still feel the presence of the statue behind me, though I dared not look. I knew it was there, watching, waiting. The wind picked up again, carrying with it a strange sound, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to rise from the ground itself. It was faint at first, but it quickly grew louder, more distinct. It sounded almost like a voice. A voice that was speaking in a language I didn't understand, but its tone was unmistakable, demanding, commanding, as if it had been waiting for me to hear it all along. You can't leave. You never will. The words felt like they were inside my head, echoing through my thoughts. The sound reverberated in my skull, twisting and distorting the air around me. I closed my eyes, trying to block it out, but it was too late. The fear, the dread, it was already consuming me. I opened my eyes, and there it was again, the statue, its shadow looming over the square, stretching out toward me. The figure was not still anymore. Its form seemed to shimmer, to waver, as if it was made of smoke and stone. I blinked, and for a moment, I thought I saw something else beneath its surface, a shadow, or a figure, something too hideous to comprehend. The air around me felt thick with the stench of rot, the same smell I had noticed earlier. It wasn't just the land that had decayed, it was as if the very earth was sick, dying, and I had become a part of it. I took another step back, my heart pounding. But the ground beneath me didn't yield. Instead, it seemed to rise, to buckle, as though the earth was shifting in response to the statue's presence. The walls of the square pressed in on me, closing the space until I felt trapped. A sudden noise broke the silence, like the cracking of stone. I looked down. The cobblestones beneath my feet were moving. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The ground was twisting, reshaping, as if the earth was alive, as if the very foundation of the square was being restructured by some unseen force. My legs buckled beneath me, and I fell to my knees, the earth beneath me shaking. And then, the statue's eyes, those cold, dead eyes, shifted, no longer gazing straight ahead, but locking onto me. Look deeper. The whisper came again, clear this time, almost mocking. It was not a voice from the wind. It was not a voice from the earth. It was the voice of the statue itself. I couldn't look away. The world around me seemed to collapse, as if everything, every stone, every breath, every thought, was drawn into that single gaze. And in that moment, I understood. The statue wasn't watching me. It was waiting for me to see. The world had stopped. My mind was suspended in that single, frozen moment. The air had thickened, suffocating me as if every breath was being drawn out slowly by some unseen force. The statue's gaze, intense, unwavering, was like an anchor. It held me there, binding me to the ground, to the earth beneath me. Look deeper. The words echoed in my head, over and over, like a chant, a command that seemed to reverberate through my very bones. My thoughts raced in disarray, but no matter how much I willed myself to turn away, I couldn't. I couldn't tear my eyes from the statue. The stone, it was alive. I felt it in every nerve, every heartbeat. The cracks in the surface seemed to pulse with some strange energy, as if the statue was breathing, alive with some ancient, primal force. Its eyes were no longer just empty stone, they were like windows, no, portals, that led deep into the core of something far beyond human understanding. Look deeper. And I did. There was something there, something hiding beneath the cold exterior of the statue. At first, it was a subtle shift, a ripple beneath the stone, a faint flicker of shadow, like something moving behind the surface. The shadows twisted and writhed, dancing like living things, stretching and pulling as if they were reaching for me. I blinked rapidly, trying to make sense of it, but it only got worse. The shadow beneath the stone deepened. A figure began to emerge from the statue's chest, a shape that wasn't human but still seemed to resemble something of human form. It had no clear features at first, only an impression of twisted limbs and a writhing form that seemed to flicker in and out of existence as if it was being pulled between worlds. I wanted to scream, to run, but the statue's presence was too overwhelming. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. Look deeper. I felt a pressure building inside my chest, like the very air around me was being crushed by the weight of whatever was emerging from the statue. The figure took shape, its form more distinct now, its limbs elongated, twisted at unnatural angles, and its eyes, those same cold, empty pits that I had seen in the stone. But they weren't stone anymore. They were alive, full of hunger, of endless, consuming hunger. I tried to look away, but my body refused. My muscles locked, my eyes glued to the form before me, to the dark, shifting figure that now loomed out of the statue. It stepped forward, or perhaps floated forward, its form flickering like a shadow on the edge of reality. It was no longer just a figure, it was something else, something that existed outside of time, outside of reason. The air around it seemed to warp, distort, as if reality itself couldn't hold its shape in the presence of whatever this thing was. A sound, a low, guttural hum, began to fill the air. It was like a song, but not a song of music. It was a song of the earth itself, a melody that carried with it an ancient, unholy rhythm. It was a call, a summons, that I felt deep in my soul, as if my very being was being drawn into it. Look deeper. The words had become a part of me now, not just a command, but a force, something that was controlling me, shaping my every thought. I couldn't resist anymore. I had to look deeper. And then, I saw it. The figure, the thing emerging from the statue, had no face, not in the way I understood it. Instead, its head was a void, an endless, shifting blackness that seemed to absorb all light around it. From within that darkness, eyes, thousands of eyes, blinked, opening and closing at once, swirling like a vortex of nightmares. Each eye was different, each one distinct in its own twisted horror, but they all shared the same emptiness, the same hunger. It reached out toward me with its elongated hands. No, not hands, claws. The fingers were too long, too thin, and they scraped the air with a sound like metal on stone. The claws were black, slick with something that shimmered and dripped like oil. I could hear its breath now, ragged, pulling in the air with a sound that made my skin crawl. It was breathing, not like a living creature, but like something ancient, something that had never been meant to breathe at all. I could feel its presence, its mind, if it could even be called that, pressing into mine, pushing against my thoughts like a cold wind. Its hunger was inside me now, gnawing at the edges of my sanity, pulling at the fibers of my mind, threatening to unravel everything I knew. It spoke, but the sound wasn't words. It was a feeling, a knowing. I understood its message even though I didn't hear it. It was waiting. It had always been waiting. It wanted me. It wanted all of us. I felt my legs give out beneath me, my body collapse into the ground as the full weight of its presence bore down on me. I could no longer feel the earth beneath me, the air around me. All I could feel was the suffocating, all-consuming hunger that seemed to fill every space, every corner of my mind. Look deeper. But I couldn't. I couldn't handle it anymore. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to escape, but my body refused. My vision blurred, and I felt like I was being dragged down into the very heart of the statue, pulled into the endless darkness that surrounded it. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The figure, the statue, was still. The air was still. Time seemed to stretch out, holding its breath. I was alone. But I wasn't. Something had followed me. It was waiting. I don't know how long I sat there, eyes wide, mind screaming, yet paralyzed by the weight of everything I had witnessed. The silence around me was deafening. The oppressive stillness in the air felt like it was pressing in from all sides, choking the very life out of me. I tried to gather my thoughts, to regain some semblance of control over my body, but it felt like a dream, a nightmare that had bled into reality. What was real? What had just happened? The figure, the shadow that had emerged from the statue, was gone. But I felt it. Deep in my chest, a heaviness that hadn't been there before. Something was watching me, something was with me. It wasn't a physical presence. It was deeper, colder, like a memory that wasn't mine, lingering at the back of my mind, just out of reach. I slowly pulled myself to my feet, the stone underfoot cold against my palms. The statue loomed before me, its gaze still fixed, though the air around it felt different. The sense of threat had receded, but the unease had only deepened. I was no longer just a visitor, a curious observer. I was a part of it now. The wind had shifted, and a new sound began to creep into my consciousness. It was faint at first, just a whisper, like the rustling of dry leaves, but then it grew louder, sharper. I turned my head, my heart racing again. It was coming from behind me. I didn't want to turn around, but I had to. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck rise, could feel the very air around me grow thick with that same pressure I had felt before. I stood motionless, trying to steady my breathing, but the sound, the scratching, was getting closer, more pronounced. It was like something was crawling across the earth, dragging itself through the dirt, slow but relentless. I looked over my shoulder, my body trembling. The ground was undisturbed. No sign of movement. But the scratching sound was louder now, as if it was just beneath the surface, waiting for me to leave the safety of the statue. I need to leave. I need to get away. But the statue, it was calling me, somehow. Its stone eyes, though unmoving, seemed to follow my every step. The darkness of its gaze felt like a tether, pulling me back, holding me in place. Look deeper. I shook my head violently, trying to shake off the voice, the force that had taken root in my mind. I forced myself to move, to take a step away from the statue, but my legs felt like lead. Each step was slower than the last, my body unwilling to obey. That presence, that thing, was still with me. I could feel it, like the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes upon me. It's watching. I stumbled back a few more steps, my pulse quickening, when something shifted in my peripheral vision. A shadow, a movement too quick for my eyes to fully process. I whipped around, my heart pounding in my chest. Nothing. The field was empty, the stone statue standing silently in the distance. But then I noticed something that had not been there before. The stone, no longer gray, no longer lifeless, had darkened. Where once it had been cold and inert, now it had a warmth to it, a sickly, oppressive warmth that seemed to emanate from deep within. I moved closer. The cracks in the statue's surface were more pronounced, and now they seemed to pulse, as if something was stirring beneath. Something was moving. I reached out hesitantly, my fingers brushing against the stone, and a jolt shot through my body. It wasn't just the warmth of the stone that struck me, but the sensation of something inside it, something alive, thrumming beneath the surface. I jerked my hand back, but the sensation lingered, crawling under my skin. That feeling, that pulse, it was everywhere now. Everywhere I went, everywhere I looked, the ground seemed to thrum with some deep, ancient rhythm. It was the same hum, the same strange song I had heard before. But now, it was all around me. It was coming closer. I turned back toward the forest, toward the path I had taken to get here. But the trees were different now. Twisted, bent, as though they had been growing in unnatural shapes, leaning towards me like fingers of some larger, monstrous hand. The path I had taken was no longer clear. The familiar surroundings had become alien, distorted. I turned around again, and the statue was closer now, much closer. Too close. The statue's cold gaze pierced into me, and the hum from within it grew louder. Look deeper. I couldn't escape. I couldn't leave. The dark figure, the thing, was with me. And it was no longer hiding. From behind me, something shifted. Something massive. A presence that rippled through the very air, like a distortion of the world itself. I could feel it moving, circling around me, just beyond the reach of my vision. I turned again, my heart in my throat. And there it was. A shape, standing in the shadows of the trees. The same twisted, elongated limbs. The same emptiness in its eyes. But this time, it wasn't emerging from the statue. It had come for me. And it was closer than ever. The shape in the shadows moved, but it wasn't a fluid motion. It was jagged, unnatural, like the thing was struggling against the very fabric of reality. Each movement it made was a distortion, a flicker of light and shadow, as if it existed in a world just slightly askew from mine. The hum, that relentless hum, grew louder, now vibrating deep within my chest. It was inside me, pulling at something deep and buried within. Something ancient. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The figure, it was no longer hiding. It was real, or it had become real in a way that made no sense. Its form was distorted, its limbs twisted in unnatural angles, stretching like the roots of some massive, gnarly tree. The more I tried to focus on it, the less I could comprehend what I was seeing. Was it a man? A beast? A shadow? It was everything and nothing all at once. And then, its eyes. Those hollow, empty sockets, there was no face, no mouth, no skin, just a vast, dark abyss that seemed to pull at everything around it. The moment I met its gaze, my body froze. I couldn't move. I couldn't look away. The darkness in those eyes was like a weight. It was suffocating. A heavy, oppressive presence that made every part of my body scream for escape. But the more I fought against it, the more it gripped me. I felt like I was being pulled into the figure, as if I were slipping into a place I didn't belong, somewhere I could never return from. I wanted to scream, but my mouth wouldn't open. My throat was dry, tight as if it had been coated with stone. My heart hammered in my chest, but I couldn't seem to move a single muscle. The sound of its movements, the way its limbs scraped the ground, the dull snap of bone, of something unnatural, was the only thing I could hear. It grew louder, each step closer, as if it were coming from inside my head. I had to get away. I fought against the paralysis, struggled to pull my legs beneath me. It wasn't just fear anymore, it was desperation. I wasn't just terrified, I was fighting for my life. I could hear it. It was right behind me. I forced my legs to move, a step, then another. The ground seemed to shift beneath my feet, as if the very earth beneath me was being molded to something I didn't understand. Go. 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 My eyes darted to the statue again. The same oppressive gaze, the same silence, but now it felt different. More alive. The cracks in the stone seemed wider now, like a mouth ready to swallow me whole. It felt like the statue was part of it, part of this thing that was hunting me, pulling me into some dark, endless cycle. I could feel it deep in my bones. It was the statue, it was the figure, it was all one thing now. The idea ripped through my mind, but I couldn't make sense of it. I turned. I had to run. The trees, the twisted trees, had changed again. The path I had come through was gone, replaced by a maze of gnarled branches, reaching out like claws. The wind shifted, the branches creaked and groaned as though the forest itself was alive, pressing in on me, keeping me trapped. The sound of scraping grew closer, now accompanied by a faint whispering. It was calling my name. I stumbled back, my breath ragged, and collided with something hard. I whipped around, my heart leaping into my throat. The stone of the statue loomed even closer now, though the field had seemed to stretch impossibly far. I was standing directly beneath it. The towering figure, its cold eyes locked on me. But it wasn't just a statue. It was a gateway. I could feel it now, the energy surging from the cracks, pulling me in, making my skin prickle with an unnatural cold. I reached out toward it, instinctively, my body moving on its own, my mind lost in the haze of terror. The air grew colder still as I touched the stone. The instant my fingers brushed the surface, the ground shook. The world around me began to unravel, like a torn cloth being pulled apart. The trees bent in impossible angles, the sky darkened to a sickly, unnatural hue. The hum reached a crescendo, becoming a scream that I could feel deep inside me. And then, a hand shot from the cracks in the stone. It was long, impossibly thin, its skin like blackened bark, its fingers ending in claws that seemed to stretch on forever. The hand curled around my arm with a force that was both bone-crushing and cold. I couldn't scream. I couldn't move. It was pulling me toward the statue, toward the darkness, toward the thing that had been watching me all this time. I had no choice. I was lost. The last thing I remember is the whisper again, soft, like the wind, but sharp, insistent. It was the voice of something ancient, something that had been waiting for me. And then, nothing. Just a darkness that swallowed everything whole. Have you ever felt like someone was watching you, even when you were all alone? It's a strange sensation, one that creeps up your spine and curls into the pit of your stomach. But what if you were right? What if there was someone, or something, following you in the dark? It was around 2 in the morning when the call came. I was sitting on my couch, the TV flickering in the background, the quiet hum of my refrigerator the only sound in the apartment. It had been a long day, filled with the usual monotony of work, a few too many cups of coffee, and the kind of tiredness that makes you feel like you're just drifting through the motions. Nothing extraordinary. Nothing out of the ordinary. But that's the thing with life, isn't it? The ordinary is often the perfect disguise for something far worse. My phone vibrated on the coffee table, breaking the silence. At first, I thought it was just a text message. But when I glanced at the screen, I saw something that made my heart stop. There was no number, just a blank space where a name should be. I hesitated before picking it up. It was strange, unsettling, but I was curious. Maybe it was a wrong number. Maybe it was someone trying to prank me. But then again, it was late. Late enough to make me second-guess every decision I made. Hello? My voice was shaky. I wasn't sure why. The silence on the other end was thick, almost suffocating. I waited. Maybe it was just a bad connection. Maybe they were waiting for me to speak first. Then, in a low, raspy voice, a whisper came through the line. I see you. My blood ran cold. My heart thudded in my chest. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I could feel the room closing in around me. The voice wasn't familiar. It was distant, but there was something so unnervingly intimate about it, like it knew me in a way I couldn't comprehend. The whisper felt like it was inside my mind, not just on the other end of the line. Who is this? I managed to say, my voice trembling. The words felt too small, too weak, as if they couldn't stand against the suffocating fear that was creeping in. The voice didn't answer. Instead, I heard the faintest sound of breathing, heavy, labored. And then, that same voice, but this time it was more deliberate, more insistent. I know where you are. I didn't know what to do. I should hang up, I told myself. I should disconnect the call, forget about it, and try to go back to my normal, safe life. But something kept me frozen. My fingers clenched around the phone, and I could feel my pulse in my throat. I could almost hear the soft rustle of fabric, as though someone was standing just out of my sight. The line went silent again. I sat there, staring at the screen, waiting for something. Anything. But nothing came. No more voices. No more whispers. Just silence. I should have been relieved. I should have felt better. But all I could feel was an overwhelming sense of dread, as though something was wrong in the air, something that I couldn't quite put my finger on. I glanced around the room, the quiet hum of the refrigerator suddenly too loud. The familiar surroundings felt off. The couch, the walls, the soft glow of the lamp, everything seemed to be slowly shifting, becoming more distant, more foreign. The air in the room felt thicker now, as if it was pressing against me. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was there. Watching. I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to think about it. But I couldn't ignore the unease that was growing inside me. I pulled the blanket tighter around my shoulders and set the phone back down. I told myself it was just a prank, just some weirdo who found my number and thought it'd be funny. That was all. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. The sound of the wind outside had picked up, rattling the window panes in their frames. It wasn't a storm, just an ordinary wind. But the way it howled and moaned against the walls, it felt wrong. Like it was trying to tell me something. I rubbed my face, trying to shake off the nagging feeling. I needed to sleep. I needed to forget about the call. But as I closed my eyes, the feeling of being watched didn't leave. I thought I heard a movement behind me. A soft scrape. The faintest shift in the air. I whipped my head around, but there was nothing. I stared into the dark corner of the room, my breath shallow. I couldn't explain it. It was just a trick of the mind, right? But the call had been real. That voice had been real. And I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there. Watching. Waiting. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination. But the longer I stayed awake, the more it felt like I was slipping away from reality, lost in a world that didn't make sense. As I lay there in the darkness, I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't alone. I just didn't know who or what was in the room with me. The silence of the apartment was almost unbearable. It wasn't the kind of silence that makes you feel at ease. It was the kind that presses down on you, fills every corner of the room with a heaviness that makes it hard to breathe. The air felt thick, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. I tried to tell myself it was just my nerves, just the after effects of that strange call. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more it became impossible to deny. Something was wrong. I sat there on the couch, my body stiff with tension. My phone still sat on the coffee table, face down, like some uninvited guest I didn't know how to deal with. I could still hear that voice in my head, a whisper that scraped against my thoughts. I see you. I glanced around the room, trying to reassure myself. It was just a small apartment, nothing special. The kind of place that feels cozy and safe when you're alone at night, wrapped in the comfort of your own thoughts. But tonight, it felt like a trap. The walls, the windows, the door, they all seemed to be closing in on me. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second echoing like a warning. My eyes kept darting toward the windows, the darkened street outside. I couldn't remember the last time I felt this exposed, this vulnerable. The thought that someone, or something, could be watching me from the shadows was enough to send a cold shiver down my spine. I reached for my phone, my fingers trembling as I picked it up. The screen was dark, but when I pressed the home button, it lit up. There, on the screen, was the same blank space where the number should have been. A chill ran through me. There was no record of the call. No history. Nothing. I could feel my chest tightening. Maybe I was losing it. Maybe the stress, the exhaustion, was finally getting to me. It wouldn't be the first time. But then, there was the voice. The breath on the other end. It was real. I wasn't imagining it. A soft creak echoed from the hallway. I froze. The sound came from the direction of the bedroom, where the door stood slightly ajar. I couldn't tell if it was the wind or something else, maybe just the old building settling. But it felt different. It felt deliberate. I strained my ears, trying to listen, but the sound had stopped. The apartment was still, too still. The silence was suffocating. My mind raced, imagining all sorts of possibilities. Maybe it was just my neighbors, maybe it was just the pipes. But the thought didn't sit right. The creak had been too slow, too intentional. I stood up, my legs shaky beneath me. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to find, but I couldn't sit there any longer. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. The oppressive silence seemed to stretch on forever as I stepped toward the hallway, my footsteps echoing louder than they should have in the quiet apartment. The closer I got to the bedroom, the more the air seemed to shift. It felt colder now, the temperature dropping inexplicably, as though the walls themselves were exhaling a chill. My breath came in shallow bursts, and I tried to steady myself, telling myself it was just my nerves. Just my mind playing tricks on me. I reached the door. It was still slightly open, just a crack wide enough to send a sliver of light from the living room spilling into the darkness beyond. I could see nothing inside, just shadows and the soft glow from the lamp in the other room. But there was something about the darkness in it that didn't feel right. It was too deep, too consuming. I slowly pushed the door open, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was exactly as I'd left it, bed neatly made, clothes scattered across the chair, nothing out of place. But there was a lingering sense of wrongness. The kind of wrongness you can't explain, but you can feel in every fiber of your being. I stepped inside, glancing over my shoulder to make sure no one was behind me. The air was colder now, almost freezing, and I wrapped my arms around myself, shivering. I looked around the room, my eyes scanning for anything unusual. Nothing. And then, I heard it again. That soft creak. But this time, it was closer. A slow, deliberate sound, as though someone was moving just out of sight. I whipped my head around, but there was nothing. Just the empty bed. The curtains fluttering lightly in the breeze from the slightly open window. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to check the apartment. I needed to know that I was alone. I turned and hurried out of the room, moving quickly down the hallway. The living room was still as silent as before, but the oppressive feeling lingered, hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. I glanced at the windows, half expecting to see someone standing outside, watching me. But there was nothing. I checked the bathroom, the closet, even behind the furniture. Nothing. Everything was exactly where it should be, but the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. I was beginning to doubt my own senses. Maybe it was just paranoia. Maybe I was letting the call get to me, letting my mind run wild. But even as I tried to convince myself it was nothing, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I finally sat back down on the couch, my head in my hands. The fear, the uncertainty, was suffocating. But as I sat there in the dim light, I realized something. There was no sound. No noise. Not a single creak, not a whisper, not a breath. Just silence. It was almost worse than the noise. The absence of sound was like a warning, a sign that something was coming, something that I couldn't escape. The phone on the coffee table buzzed again, and I flinched, my heart leaping into my throat. I didn't want to pick it up. I didn't want to know who or what was calling now. But I had no choice. I reached for the phone, my fingers cold as I swiped the screen. The number was still blank. But this time, there was a message. A single, simple line of text. I'm still here. The message on the screen blurred in my vision, my heart hammering against my chest. I'm still here. The words seemed to drip with a kind of cold finality, as though the sender had been waiting for me to read them, to feel the weight of their presence. My fingers trembled as I stared at the message, unsure of what to do next. I wanted to throw the phone across the room. I wanted to scream, to break free from this growing terror that had begun to consume me. But I couldn't move. My mind was locked in place, processing the impossible. Who was this? How did they know? The room felt smaller, as though the walls were closing in, inch by inch. The silence was suffocating now, almost unbearable. The steady hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of cars passing on the street below, everything that had once seemed so normal now felt distant, like it belonged to another world, a world where nothing could touch me. This was my world. My safe space. Or at least, it had been. I could feel my breath becoming shallow, my chest tightening as the panic set in. I had to get out of here. I had to do something. But my legs felt like stone, rooted to the spot. The message was still there, taunting me, daring me to respond. My thumb hovered over the screen, unsure of what to say, but I couldn't bring myself to type anything. What if I said the wrong thing? What if I invited this thing into my life even more? I looked around the apartment, my eyes darting from corner to corner, expecting to see something, anything, move. But there was nothing. Nothing but the oppressive weight of the silence and the cold, creeping dread that had settled into my bones. The phone buzzed again, this time louder, more insistent. I nearly dropped it as the screen flashed with another message. I see you looking around. I'm closer than you think. I froze. My mind spun, struggling to comprehend what I had just read. The words felt like a physical blow, as if the sender was inside my head, reading my every thought. I hadn't even moved, hadn't looked anywhere in particular. How could they know that? A cold sweat broke out on my forehead, my fingers numb as I slowly turned the phone over, trying to steady my hands. My breathing came in ragged gasps, but I forced myself to look around again. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch further now, darker, more sinister. The window in the living room, was it always that open? I couldn't remember. A flicker of movement caught my eye. I spun around, my heart in my throat. But it was just the curtain swaying slightly in the breeze. Nothing more. Or was there something more? I felt my grip on the phone tighten as I slowly stood, my body trembling from head to toe. The temperature in the room had dropped again, and I could see my breath fogging in the air. The chill was unnatural, not from the draft of the window, but from something deeper. Something colder. The phone buzzed again. Another message. You're not alone. I couldn't breathe. My throat tightened, and I suddenly felt like I was choking on the air. I had to get out of here. I had to leave. But where could I go? The streets outside were empty, and my car was parked blocks away. What if whoever, or whatever, was doing this was already watching me, waiting for me to step outside? What if I was walking right into its trap? I tried to calm myself, to think logically, but the fear made it impossible. I couldn't focus. I couldn't reason. All I could do was feel the presence, that invisible force that seemed to be closing in from all sides. The weight of it was crushing, suffocating. Then, from somewhere deep inside the apartment, I heard a sound. A faint scraping, like something being dragged slowly across the floor. It came from the direction of the hallway. My body froze in place, and for a moment, I thought I might collapse. The sound was so slow, so deliberate, as if whatever it was wanted me to hear it. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The air was thick now, heavy with an unbearable tension. I couldn't stay in this apartment anymore. I had to find out what was happening. I had to confront whatever was causing this. But as I started to take a step forward, something in the hallway caught my attention. The door to the bedroom. It was wide open now. How had that happened? I could have sworn I left it partially closed. I took a slow step toward the hallway, my mind racing. I couldn't let myself think about the phone, the messages, or the unseen presence. I just had to get to the door, check the bedroom, make sure there was nothing in there. The scraping sound was louder now, closer. It was as if it was right on the other side of the bedroom door, waiting for me to make my move. I stood there for a moment, paralyzed. Then, in one swift motion, I stepped toward the hallway. I didn't want to go, but I couldn't stay where I was any longer. I had to know. As I reached the door, I took a deep breath, pushing it open. The light from the living room spilled into the room, casting long shadows on the floor. The room looked exactly the same as it had before, nothing out of place. The bed was still made, the clothes still scattered on the chair, the curtains still swaying gently in the wind. But then, I saw it. On the floor, near the far corner of the room, was something I hadn't noticed before. A piece of paper. Torn, crumpled, but with something scrawled across it in thick black ink. "I've been waiting for you." I didn't want to touch it. I didn't want to know. But my fingers moved against my will, reaching down to pick up the paper. As soon as my hand made contact, a sharp, painful jolt ran up my arm like an electric shock. I dropped the paper, stumbling backward, my breath coming in panicked gasps. I was shaking now, my whole body trembling violently. I turned to leave the room, to run, but before I could, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate, getting closer. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I didn't dare to look back. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like lead, too heavy to move. The footsteps behind me were slow, deliberate, but they were getting closer with every passing second. My heart hammered in my chest, each beat a loud reminder of the terror that was closing in on me. The floor creaked beneath my feet as I moved toward the hallway, my breathing shallow and erratic. The cold air seemed to cling to me, crawling up my spine, chilling me to the bone. It was as if the very walls of the apartment had come alive, pressing in on me from all sides. I reached the living room and turned the corner, half expecting to see something, anything, waiting for me. But the room was empty, just as it had been before. The dim light from the kitchen flickered, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. But there was no one there. No one visible. I didn't understand. How could I hear the footsteps if there was no one there? How could I feel the presence of something so close, yet see nothing at all? It didn't make sense. I had to be imagining it. I had to be. But deep down, I knew I wasn't. This was real. Too real. I ran a hand through my hair, trying to collect my thoughts, trying to focus. I needed to stay calm. I needed to think clearly. But my mind was racing, spinning in every direction. The phone, the messages, the scraping, the footsteps. It all felt like one continuous nightmare that I couldn't escape from. A sudden movement in the corner of the room caught my eye. My breath caught in my throat. The shadow. The shadow that had been still moments ago now seemed to twitch, to shift ever so slightly. I didn't want to look, but my gaze was drawn to it. It was like an invisible force pulling my attention, making it impossible to look away. There it was again, a faint scraping sound. This time, it wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from behind me, from the living room. I whirled around, my pulse pounding in my ears. Nothing. But I could feel it. I could feel it pressing in on me from every angle. The very air around me felt thick, suffocating, as though it was trying to swallow me whole. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the panic rising, threatening to take over. I had to get out of here. I had to find a way to escape. I stumbled toward the door, the cold floor beneath my feet suddenly feeling more like ice. As I reached for the doorknob, I heard a voice. A whisper, so faint that I wasn't sure if I'd imagined it or if it was real. "Don't go." It was soft, barely audible, but unmistakable. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I turned around, scanning the room once more, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow, from corner to corner. But again, there was nothing. No one. No one except me. I stepped back from the door, my hand shaking as it hovered just above the knob. The air was thick with tension. The whispers, the sounds, they were all blending together now, swirling in my mind. I couldn't make sense of them. I couldn't escape them. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the silence returned. Heavy. Oppressive. The kind of silence that made you question whether you were truly alone. My breath steadied as I forced myself to focus. I couldn't leave. Not yet. I needed answers. I needed to know what was happening. Who was doing this? Why? And most importantly, how could I stop it? The phone buzzed again. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. Slowly, almost reluctantly, I pulled it from my pocket. My thumb hovered over the screen as I stared at the incoming message. "You still think you're alone?" The words hit me like a punch to the gut, stealing the air from my lungs. My stomach twisted in knots. No, I didn't think I was alone. I knew I wasn't. Not anymore. I opened the message, my hands trembling as I read. "I'm always here." The room seemed to shrink around me, the walls pressing in tighter and tighter, as if they were closing off all exits. My eyes flicked toward the window. The night outside seemed darker than it had been before, more oppressive, more suffocating. I couldn't see anything beyond the glass, just an impenetrable black void. I could hear the rustling again. Soft at first, like the sound of something moving, something shifting in the darkness. But then it grew louder, more distinct. It was coming from behind me. From the hallway. I turned slowly, my heart racing again. This time, I couldn't ignore it. The sound was unmistakable, like something was dragging itself across the floor, something heavy, something that shouldn't be there. I backed away toward the door, my hand gripping the knob with a strength I didn't know I had. But before I could turn it, the scraping sound stopped. The silence returned. And then, I heard it again. "You shouldn't have opened the door." I turned just in time to see a shadow move in the hallway. But this time, it wasn't just a shadow. It was a shape. A figure. Tall, thin, almost too tall, standing in the doorway of the bedroom. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. And I knew, deep down, that it wasn't something that was meant to be there. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I ran. I ran as fast as my legs could carry me, crashing through the hallway, past the living room, and toward the door. I didn't care if it was locked. I didn't care if I was about to face whatever was lurking in the dark. I had to get out. But when I reached for the handle, it was already too late. The door wouldn't open. It was locked. Panic surged through me as I jerked at the doorknob, twisting and pulling with every ounce of strength I had left. But the door wouldn't budge. It felt as though the very building itself had turned against me, sealing me inside with whatever was waiting just beyond the walls. The once familiar apartment was now a cage, its corners darkening, suffocating me in its silence. I spun around, my eyes desperately scanning the room. The shadow, the figure in the hallway, was still there, its outline flickering like a malfunctioning television screen. It stood motionless, a long, unnatural shape that stretched and contorted, its limbs bending in ways that shouldn't have been possible. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. The air felt thick, as though I was submerged underwater, each breath a struggle to pull in. Every sound, every creak, every shift in the room was amplified, reverberating through my skull. I was hyper-aware of everything, yet nothing made sense. The figure moved again, this time stepping into the room, its long, dark limbs dragging behind it, a disturbing slowness that made my blood run cold. I tried to back away, but my legs were unresponsive, as though the ground beneath me had become quicksand, swallowing me with every step. My heart pounded so loudly I could hear it in my ears, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The phone still clutched and my hand buzzed again. I didn't want to look, but the compulsion to check was overwhelming. You shouldn't have opened the door. I could feel the message in my bones, the words echoing in my head, reverberating through every fiber of my being. But it wasn't the words that scared me, it was the implication, the undeniable truth that whatever was happening, whatever was coming for me, was real. More real than anything else in this apartment. I turned back toward the door. There was no other option. I had to get out. With one final, desperate yank, I felt something give. The door cracked open just enough for a sliver of light to spill through from the hallway, but it wasn't enough. The figure was there now, standing directly in front of me, blocking my escape. It was taller than I had imagined, taller than any human should have been. Its body twisted unnaturally, and its face, if it could be called that, was a mass of shifting shadows, its features constantly changing like a reflection in a broken mirror. I could see glimpses of eyes, though they were not human, their shapes jagged, pulsating in and out of existence. I could feel the coldness coming from it. Not just physical cold, but something deeper, an emptiness that seemed to absorb the warmth of the room. A void that was waiting to consume me. My body finally responded, adrenaline pushing through the paralysis that had gripped me. I pushed against the door with everything I had, but the figure was moving closer, its long fingers reaching out toward me, its nails scraping against the wood. Scrape. 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 The noise reverberated in my mind, sending jolts of panic down my spine. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I knew was that I had to escape. I had to escape before it reached me. I slammed the door shut, the force of it rattling the frame. For a brief moment, the room was quiet, almost peaceful. My breath was heavy, my chest rising and falling in quick, shallow bursts. I stood there, pressed against the door, listening to the silence that had returned. But I knew it wouldn't last. The stillness was just a prelude to something far worse. thud. The sound came from the other side of the door, a soft, deliberate thump that sent a wave of cold fear washing over me. It was as though something had been standing there, waiting for just the right moment to strike. I backed away from the door, my eyes wide, heart hammering. The room felt small and now, more confining, the air thick with the weight of whatever presence lingered just beyond my reach. The phone buzzed once more. You can't escape. I couldn't take it any longer. I had to get out. I had to break free, even if it meant facing whatever was on the other side. The apartment, the walls, they were no longer safe. There was nowhere left to run. I darted for the window, my fingers trembling as I grabbed the blinds and jerked them open. The night outside was as black as ink, an endless void that stretched out into nothingness. There was no streetlight, no distant glow of another building. Just pure darkness. I pulled at the window, but it was stuck. I pushed again, harder this time, feeling the window shake beneath my hands. But it didn't give. The window was sealed shut. Thud. It was louder this time, more insistent. The figure was getting closer, its presence now undeniable. I could hear it, feel it, its breath coming in ragged, unnatural gasps, echoing from the hallway. The air was growing colder still, and I could almost hear the darkness itself creeping in, wrapping itself around me. I turned, desperate to find any escape. The door was my only option now. I knew what I had to do. With one last, frantic push, I tore open the door and ran straight into the darkness of the hallway. The figure was still there, but this time I didn't wait to see what it would do. I ran, faster than I ever thought I could, my feet pounding against the floor, the sound of my own footsteps drowning out everything else. But the thing was still there, still following me. It was only when I reached the end of the hallway, only when I saw the door leading outside, that I realized something terrible. The door wasn't opening. The lock was still in place. The phone buzzed again, but this time the message wasn't a warning. You've been here before. I froze. The words were like a punch to my gut. Something in my mind clicked, something deep and buried. I had been here before. I had run down this very hallway. I had tried to escape this very same way. And then, the figure stepped into the light. It wasn't a figure at all. It was me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. And as I stood there, paralyzed by the realization, I heard the voice again, whispering in the back of my mind. It's always been you. The room went black. It was a small package. Unmarked. No address. No name. It arrived at my doorstep one cold evening, just as I was coming home from work. The first thing I noticed was how ordinary it looked. A simple cardboard box, slightly crumpled on the corners, but nothing too unusual. I almost passed it by, thinking it was a mistake or some kind of promotional item I'd forgotten about. But something about it made me hesitate. A strange weight in my chest, as though the air around me had thickened. I picked it up. No return address, nothing. Only my name, typed in bold, black letters on the front. I turned the box over, expecting maybe a stamp or a small piece of tape to peel back. But there was nothing. No hint of where it had come from. The silence around me was unnerving, too still for my comfort. The cold seemed to deepen, pressing in on me like it wanted me to leave the package alone. But I didn't. I carried it inside and set it on the kitchen table. As soon as I placed it down, I felt the weight of it, a sinking sensation as though it had been waiting there for much longer than I'd known. The quiet of the room intensified. No hum of the refrigerator. No ticking of the clock. Just the sound of my own breathing. I slowly opened the box. Inside was an old photo album, leather-bound, with cracked edges that told me it had seen years of neglect. The cover was faded and worn, but I couldn't make out the details. I ran my fingers across the surface, feeling the bumps and textures beneath my fingertips, like old scars that had been buried too long. Something about it made my heart race. I opened the album. The first few pages were filled with black and white photographs, photos that looked like they had been taken in another era. Faces I didn't recognize, standing in unfamiliar places. There were no names or dates, no captions, just the faces. All of them staring blankly, their expressions unreadable. The air grew colder, and I found myself looking over my shoulder. It was just a picture, I told myself. But the unease was growing. I kept flipping through the pages, each photograph more unsettling than the last. There were people in strange poses, their eyes looking past the camera as though they weren't aware of their surroundings. Then, I turned to a page that made my breath catch. The photo was of a house. My house. But it wasn't the house I knew. The house in the photo was much older, with different windows, and the front door had a different design. I had never seen this house before, but somehow it felt wrong. The photograph wasn't like the others. There was something off about it, a shadow that seemed to hover over the house, but I couldn't quite make out what it was. A sudden chill ran through me. I turned to the next page, my fingers trembling. This time, there was a photo of a woman standing in front of the house. She was facing away from the camera, her long hair flowing in the wind, but her posture was stiff, unnatural. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was waiting for someone, but not for me. And in the background, just barely visible, was something moving, a figure, almost hidden in the shadows, but watching her. Watching the photo being taken. I closed the album quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. What was going on? Where had this come from? Why did it feel like something was watching me now? I tried to tell myself it was just a strange coincidence. A series of old photographs, maybe even a prank. But I couldn't shake the feeling. The sensation of eyes on me. I could almost hear a low whisper, like a voice just out of reach. And then, the knocking began. Soft at first, like someone tapping gently at the door. But there was no one there. I went to the window, peering out, but the street was empty. Nothing. I sat down, gripping the photo album tightly in my hands. The knocking continued. A rhythmic pattern, as if someone was trying to tell me something. But the silence between the taps, it was deafening. Suddenly, I remembered something. A detail I hadn't noticed before. On the last page of the album, barely visible in the corner, was a date. A date that hadn't yet arrived. Tomorrow. I felt the ground shift beneath me, the room narrowing as my thoughts spiraled. What had I gotten myself into? And then, a voice broke through the quiet. A voice that wasn't mine. Put it down. The words came from the album, but they weren't written on the page. They were spoken aloud, like a whisper in the room. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. Put it down. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command. And it was the last thing I heard before the lights went out. I froze. The darkness swallowed the room almost instantly. The light bulb above flickered once before giving out completely. It wasn't the power going out, I realized, but something else. My head spun, and for a second, I almost thought I was imagining things. But the voice, that soft, commanding whisper, was still fresh in my mind. Put it down. I wasn't sure if I had heard it aloud or if it had been in my head. But the urgency behind it sent a wave of cold terror through me. My pulse raced, each thud in my chest echoing like a drum in the quiet. I stood there, staring at the now pitch-black room, trying to get my bearings. My hands shook, still clutching the photo album as though it had grown heavier in the dark. The air felt thick, charged with an electric hum that I hadn't noticed before. My eyes struggled to adjust to the darkness. I stepped back, away from the table, but it felt like I was moving through molasses, every step slow and labored. The knocking started again. It was louder now, more insistent. The rhythm had changed, though, almost like a series of short, sharp raps against the door. One after another, too quick to be human. I was paralyzed. I didn't want to look at the door, didn't want to confirm it was real. But the sound, it gnawed at my nerves, tearing away any semblance of peace. I slowly turned, reaching out for my phone. The light from the screen would be my only source of comfort, my only escape from the oppressive darkness. My hand hovered just above it when I noticed something else. The shadows. They weren't where they should have been. I blinked, focusing on the wall opposite me. The shadows were moving. Small, erratic flickers darted across the room, almost like insects skittering just beyond the edges of my vision. But it wasn't the shadows that terrified me. It was the shapes they formed. Long, thin limbs stretched across the walls, like hands reaching out, but with no bodies to match them. I rubbed my eyes, forcing myself to look again, but the shapes remained. The knocking was relentless now. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The walls felt as if they were closing in, pressing against me, but the shadows seemed to mock my fear, contorting and twisting around me like a living nightmare. Every flicker made the air heavier, more suffocating. I finally grabbed my phone, unlocking it with trembling hands. The screen lit up, but the sudden brightness stung my eyes. I tried to steady myself, to make sense of what was happening, but as I looked down, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The date. The one from the photo album. The one that hadn't yet arrived. It was today. The shadows twisted, growing more pronounced now, like they were alive. I could almost hear them breathing, a soft, slow hiss that seemed to crawl under my skin. But I couldn't tear my eyes away from the phone screen. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Suddenly, my phone buzzed. It was a notification. A text message. I didn't recognize the number. There was no name, just a blank message. But the message itself made my heart stop. Don't go to the door. I read it again. And again. But the words didn't change. Don't go to the door. I wanted to drop the phone, but my hands wouldn't obey me. They were shaking violently, my fingers stiff as if someone was holding them down. I could hear the whisper again, louder this time, much closer, as though someone was standing right next to me. Put it down. My mind screamed at me to throw the photo album away, to burn it, to forget everything. But my body wouldn't listen. I was frozen, trapped in my own fear. I felt it then, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. Something was in the room with me. The shadows had stopped moving, but I could feel them, pressing against me, suffocating me in their cold, unseen grip. There was another knock. It wasn't at the door this time. It was at the window. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The faintest outline of a figure stood in the reflection of the window. A silhouette that didn't belong. I felt it before I saw it, the weight of the presence outside, staring at me through the glass. I couldn't see its face, but I knew it was watching. It was waiting. The room felt alive with tension. The shadows had thickened, and I could almost hear their breath, the hissing becoming louder, more insistent. I glanced down at the photo album again. The faces stared back at me, blank and emotionless, but in the next photograph, something was different. The woman from the house. She was staring directly at me now, her eyes wide with terror. Her hands were outstretched, her mouth open in a silent scream. And behind her, just barely visible, was the figure from the window. My stomach churned. The photo was changing. I slammed the album shut. The knocking continued, now coming from all directions. The floor creaked as though someone was walking around me, circling. I didn't know what to do, didn't know if I was imagining it all or if it was really happening. I had to get out of there. I turned, running for the door, but as I reached for the handle, a cold hand grasped my wrist. It was ice. It burned through my skin. I tried to pull away, but the grip was unyielding. The whispering voice returned, this time filling the entire room. Put it down. And then everything went black. I woke up with a jolt, gasping for air, my body drenched in cold sweat. My heart hammered in my chest as I blinked, trying to adjust to the dim light filtering through the curtains. Everything was still. Too still. The room was exactly as I'd left it, no sign of the dark presence that had gripped me moments before. I was lying on the floor, the photo album still clutched tightly in my hands. I had no memory of falling, no recollection of how I had ended up here. The clock on the wall ticked, but the time had changed. It was morning now, but it hadn't been when I'd first opened the package. I checked my phone again, my fingers trembling. The message was still there, sitting in my inbox, "Don't go to the door." But now, I could feel the weight of it, the significance pressing on me. How long had I been unconscious? What had happened in the dark? The knock at the door. The whispering voice. The shadows. I stood slowly, rubbing my face, trying to push the panic down. My thoughts felt disjointed, like I was piecing together a puzzle that didn't quite fit. The room was empty, and yet it wasn't. I could feel it, the tension in the air, the faint presence that lingered like a heavy fog. I wasn't alone. I glanced around the room, but nothing seemed out of place. The photo album was still in my hands, its worn leather cover a stark contrast to the rest of the clean, familiar surroundings. The knocking had stopped, but the silence felt wrong, as if it were a trap, waiting for me to make a mistake. My thoughts raced. What was going on? Was I losing my mind? I glanced at the window, half expecting to see that figure from the reflection again. But the window was just a window, ordinary, calm. The street outside was empty, no signs of life. I breathed a sigh of relief, but it was short-lived. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The album in my hands felt heavier than before. I reluctantly opened it again. The photographs were exactly the same, except for one detail. There was something new in the last picture. It was a reflection, faint but undeniable, in the glass of the window. The figure. The same shadowy outline from before. But now, it was clearer, more defined, as though it was closer. No longer a distant shape, this time it was standing right behind the woman, inches away, its face just out of view. I slammed the album shut again, my heart racing. Then I noticed something else. A piece of paper tucked under the photo album. It hadn't been there before. I unfolded it carefully, trying not to tear it. The handwriting was sharp, uneven, like it had been written in haste. Don't trust what you see. The house is not safe. They are coming. You can't stop it. I dropped the paper, my hands shaking. This wasn't just some random package. This was a warning. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something had changed, and it was connected to this house. This place where I had lived for so many years, and yet, now it felt foreign. The knock at the door returned, louder this time. 3 quick raps, each one like a hammer pounding against my skull. I froze, unable to move, as if the sound had trapped me in place. The walls felt closer, the room shrinking, the air growing heavier with every passing second. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. I couldn't escape whatever had attached itself to me, to this house. I glanced around, searching for any way out, but there was no way forward, no path to safety. And then I saw it. The door. It was ajar. I had locked it. I knew I had locked it the moment I came inside. But now it was open. Just a crack, but enough for me to see the hallway beyond. A hallway that hadn't been there before. I felt the cold grip of fear tightening around my chest. I had to know what was out there. I moved toward the door, each step deliberate, but my legs felt as if they were made of stone, each movement more laborious than the last. The knock came again, louder, more forceful. The sound echoed down the hallway. I reached for the door, my hand trembling as I pushed it open fully. The hallway stretched out before me. It looked like my house, but it wasn't. The walls were darker, the air thicker, and the shadows deeper. The familiar creak of the floorboards was gone, replaced by an unsettling silence. And then I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound. A whisper. But this time, it wasn't in my head. It was real. And it was coming from down the hallway. I had to know what it was. I had to. I took a step forward, my breath shallow, my heartbeat ringing in my ears. The whisper grew louder, and I could make out the words now, though they sent chills down my spine. Come closer. I didn't want to. I should have turned and run, but my feet were already moving, pulling me down the dark hallway. The whisper seemed to guide me, drawing me in like a magnet. I passed the living room, the kitchen, everything familiar, yet wrong, as if I had walked into a different version of my house. I could feel something in the air, something malevolent that clung to the walls, to the floor, to me. I reached the end of the hall. The door to the basement was open. I hadn't opened it. I couldn't see anything inside, but I felt it, the cold emanating from it, the heaviness in the air. The whisper came again, but this time it wasn't just words. It was a command. Come in. I stepped forward, the darkness pulling at me, the silence suffocating. I had to know what was in that basement. I couldn't stop now. I had to face whatever this was, whatever was waiting for me. And then, just as my foot crossed the threshold, I heard a voice. This time, it wasn't a whisper. It was a scream. And it was coming from inside the basement. The scream echoed through the hallway, reverberating off the walls, filling the air with an unbearable sense of terror. It was sharp, desperate, and filled with a raw anguish that sent a shockwave through my entire body. For a moment, I froze. My mind raced, trying to process what I had just heard. It couldn't have been real. It had to be my imagination, some trick of the mind, some lingering echo of whatever nightmare I had fallen into the night before. But the scream was too real. I took a shaky breath, feeling my body tremble as I stepped closer to the basement door. It loomed before me, dark and uninviting, yet it was the only path forward. The air around it felt heavy, as though something unseen was pressing against me, keeping me from moving. I didn't know what I was doing anymore. Fear had clouded my thoughts, but I couldn't stop myself. Something was compelling me forward, some force, some invisible pull that I couldn't resist. Every instinct told me to turn around, to lock the door, to leave the house and never come back. But the darkness inside the basement called to me, whispering secrets I didn't want to hear. The basement door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound like nails on a chalkboard, sending a shiver down my spine. The air was thick and cold, the stench of mildew and something else, something metallic, hanging in the atmosphere. It was suffocating. My skin crawled as I stepped into the shadowy space, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The basement was more than just dark, it was wrong. The floorboards creaked under my weight, groaning with each step. But it wasn't the house settling, it was the sound of something shifting beneath me. Something that shouldn't have been there. I scanned the room, but I couldn't see anything beyond the faintest outlines of old furniture and forgotten boxes. There were no lights. The only illumination came from the weak sliver of daylight creeping through a small window near the ceiling, barely enough to reveal the edges of the room. And then I saw it. In the far corner, partially obscured by shadow, was a figure. It was hunched over, its back to me. The figure was unnaturally still, but I could feel the presence of something alive, something waiting. My heart thudded in my chest as I took a hesitant step forward. But before I could make another move, I heard it again. The voice, but this time it wasn't a whisper. It was a voice full of pain, full of terror. Help, please. It was faint, but unmistakable. The voice seemed to crawl through the air, like it was coming from all directions at once. The figure in the corner shifted. I gasped, frozen in place. My mind screamed at me to turn and run, to escape whatever this was, but my feet remained glued to the floor. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the shape in the corner. It was as if it had a hold on me, drawing me in. It shifted again, this time standing up straight, though it was still partially hidden by the darkness. I could feel my breath catching in my throat, each inhale shallow and ragged. What was it? Was it human? It didn't look like anything I had ever seen before. I took a step back, but the floor creaked louder, betraying my position. The figure turned. It wasn't human. Its face was distorted, a twisted parody of something familiar. The eyes were too wide, too black, like pits of endless void. Its skin was pale, stretched too tight over a gaunt, hollow frame. It didn't blink. It didn't move like a person. It flickered. One moment it was standing still, and the next it was closer, inches from me. I stumbled backward, a choked scream escaping my throat. But my feet couldn't find the strength to run. My legs felt like lead, my body paralyzed by the sheer presence of the thing before me. It reached out a hand, no, not a hand, but something more grotesque, more skeletal. It was long and clawed, the fingers twitching like they were eager to grasp onto something. My throat closed. I couldn't breathe. The voice came again, but now it was a growl. "Why are you here?" It wasn't a question. It was a demand. I couldn't answer. My mouth was dry, my tongue frozen in place. I tried to speak, to explain, to apologize, but no sound came. My thoughts were a jumbled mess, my entire mind consumed by the sight of this thing, this creature. I wanted to run, but it was as if the air had thickened around me, each breath a struggle. The creature took a step forward, and then another. It didn't move like a person. It didn't walk. It slid, like a shadow creeping closer and closer. I could feel its presence growing stronger, pressing against me, drowning me in its unnaturalness. I took a step back, and this time I couldn't help it. I ran. I turned, my feet finally finding the strength to move, but as I darted toward the door, I heard the unmistakable sound of someone following me. Their footsteps, slow but deliberate, echoed in the basement, too close. I reached the door, my hand fumbling for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The door was stuck. I pulled harder, panic flooding my senses, but the door didn't move. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I spun around, my breath ragged, eyes wide, desperate to escape. The creature was right behind me. I screamed, the sound swallowed by the thick air of the basement. Its cold hand clamped down on my shoulder, and the world went dark. The last thing I heard was its voice, a whisper so close that it was in my ear. "Now, it's too late." And then, nothing. I awoke to darkness. At first, I thought I had gone blind. I blinked rapidly, trying to adjust my eyes, but no light came. I could feel the cold dampness of the floor beneath me, the rough texture of stone against my skin. I was lying down, but I had no memory of falling or how I had ended up in this place. The basement? Was I still in the basement? The air was thick, heavy, and I struggled to take a deep breath. It felt as though something was pressing against my chest, weighing me down. The faint smell of decay lingered in the air, and I realized I was not alone. There was a presence, a hum of energy that buzzed at the edge of my senses. It was almost imperceptible, like static before a storm. I tried to move, but my limbs were stiff, uncooperative, as though I hadn't moved in hours or longer. I forced myself to sit up, my heart pounding. I could hear my own breath, shallow, uneven, but nothing else. No whispering, no footsteps, no eerie growl from the creature. The silence was suffocating. Slowly, I pushed myself to my feet, my knees weak, my body trembling. My mind raced, but every thought felt heavy, like it was sinking into a fog. I didn't know where I was, but I knew it wasn't the basement I had seen before. This place, it felt different. It was wrong. I reached out, my hand brushing the cold, damp stone walls. They were smooth, unnaturally so, as though they had been carved, shaped by some force far beyond human. My fingers brushed over strange symbols etched into the stone, their meanings indecipherable, but the shapes seemed familiar, as if I had seen them before, just out of the corner of my eye. But I couldn't place them. The air grew colder, and a chill ran through me, deep into my bones. Something shifted, something subtle but unmistakable. A presence, much closer now, and it made my skin crawl. I froze. It was there, just behind me. I whipped around, my heart in my throat, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the blackness, the oppressive silence. Still, the sensation remained, the feeling that something was watching me, studying me. The tension in the air was unbearable. I tried to calm myself, to think logically. My breath was ragged, and my mind felt like it was splintering, torn between the rational and the irrational. I remembered the creature, the scream, the flickering form. I couldn't shake the image of it, the distorted, twisted thing with eyes that swallowed light. The memory of its voice, its growl, still echoed in the back of my mind. But had it been real? Was it part of some nightmare? Or had I truly seen it, felt it, in the dark corners of this place? I stumbled forward, my legs weak, my vision blurry. The room around me seemed to stretch and contract, as though it were alive, breathing with me. It felt like I was moving through some kind of dream, but the terror in my chest told me this wasn't a dream. This was real. I was here. And whatever was here with me, whatever had found me, was very real too. I took a step, and another, and then the light. It wasn't much, but it was something. A faint, flickering glow appeared in the distance, far down the corridor. I could just make out the shape of a door, illuminated by the diamond sliver of light. I didn't care if it was a trap. I didn't care if it was another illusion. I moved toward it. With every step, the oppressive darkness seemed to recede just a little. The buzz in the air grew louder, more insistent, as if the very walls were vibrating with energy. I didn't know I was walking toward, but I knew I couldn't stay here. I couldn't stay in this suffocating silence. The closer I got to the door, the more I felt it. Something was on the other side. A presence, thick and suffocating, waiting for me. My heart hammered faster, and I gripped the door handle, half expecting it to burn my hand, but it didn't. It was cold. I turned it, and the door creaked open. The light spilled out, bright and harsh, like a jolt of electricity. I squinted against it, trying to adjust, but something in the light felt wrong. It didn't look natural, it felt artificial, like it was forcing itself into existence. I stepped through the threshold, and my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't the basement. It wasn't my house. I had stepped into another place entirely. The room was large, cavernous, with walls that stretched upward far beyond my sight. The air was thick with dust, and the floor beneath my feet was cracked and uneven, like it hadn't been touched in centuries. Strange symbols, like those on the walls back in the dark space, were carved into the stone here too, glowing faintly in the unnatural light. The entire space hummed with an energy I couldn't understand. But it wasn't empty. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, and on that pedestal was a book. It wasn't like the photo album. It wasn't old or weathered. It was pristine, its leather cover smooth, untouched by time. The pages inside were filled with intricate drawings and symbols, pages that seemed to shift while I wasn't looking directly at them. I felt my feet move toward it, pulling me forward without my consent, my hand reaching out to touch the book, as though it were guiding me, as though it had always known I would come. And then, before I could make contact, a voice broke through the silence. This time, it wasn't a whisper. It was a command. Don't open it. I froze. The voice was cold, resonant, like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. I wanted to turn and run. I wanted to ignore the voice and escape this place, but my body was no longer my own. It was as if the room had claimed me, as if I had no choice but to listen to whatever force was guiding me. I couldn't look away from the book. I couldn't stop myself. My hand was inches from the pages. And then, the world snapped. The light, the hum, everything vanished in a blink, and I was plunged into darkness once again. The book was gone. The pedestal was gone. The room was gone. I was alone again. In the dark. But not really alone. Because I knew, somehow, that whatever had been waiting for me in that room was still with me. It was a question that kept me up at night. What is she hiding? The thought lingered in my mind long after I first noticed the strange behavior of my new neighbor, Lisa. It wasn't anything overt, but there was something unsettling about her presence. Something just off. I had recently moved into a quiet, suburban neighborhood. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's name, where lawns were manicured, and the evening air carried the hum of peaceful routines. But Lisa was different. She moved in just a few weeks before I did, and though she had been around for a while, I hadn't heard much about her from the other neighbors. No one talked about her. No one mentioned her in passing. The house she lived in was charming, a small, brick building tucked away at the end of the street. It was always neat, always perfect, except for the windows. They were always shut tight, no matter the time of day. I never saw her outside except in the brief moments when she would dart to her car, head down, eyes averted, as though avoiding any sort of interaction. I remember the first time I saw her. She was standing on her porch, holding a small package in her hands, staring at it for a long time before she carefully placed it inside her mailbox. The whole exchange was strange, too deliberate, too guarded. She looked around as if making sure no one saw her, and when she walked back inside, it was as if she had vanished. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just the silence that surrounded her, it was the air of secrecy. The unsettling way she carried herself, the way she seemed to exist at the periphery of everyone else's lives. I began to notice other things. Little oddities. For instance, every time I walked past her house, I'd hear faint scratching sounds from within. At first, I assumed it was just the house settling, but the sound didn't stop. It was rhythmic, like something or someone was scraping against the walls. One evening, I decided to take a walk around the block to clear my mind. As I passed Lisa's house, I felt a sudden shiver creep down my spine. The windows were covered with heavy curtains, blocking any view into the house. Yet, something flickered behind them. I couldn't tell if it was a shadow or just the reflection of the streetlights outside. The thought of someone being inside, someone who had been so closed off from the world, made my skin crawl. I told myself I was imagining things. It had been a long day, and my mind was playing tricks on me. But the next day, something changed. The strange noises from Lisa's house became louder, more distinct. I was certain now there was someone inside, and it wasn't just her. I had no proof, no explanation, but I couldn't ignore it. I had heard stories about people who kept secrets, about neighbors who were hiding things, dark things. What if Lisa was one of them? What if her silence wasn't just shyness, but something more? I needed to know. The next evening, I stood by my window, watching. The sun had set, and the street was bathed in a soft, golden light. Lisa's house was as quiet as ever, but the more I stared at it, the more I felt an odd sense of anticipation, like something was about to happen. That's why I saw it. A figure in the window. At first, I thought it was her, but as I squinted, I realized the shape was too large, too broad. The figure moved behind the curtains, and I caught a glimpse of something heavy, like the shape of a person dragging something across the floor. My heart pounded. I froze. I had to know what was going on. I told myself I was just being paranoid, but the uncertainty gnawed at me. I had to see it for myself. That night, after what felt like an eternity of indecision, I quietly grabbed my jacket and slipped out the front door. The cool air hit my skin as I crept toward Lisa's house. My footsteps were light, almost inaudible, but the closer I got, the more my anxiety grew. I reached the side of the house, where I knew there was a small, narrow space between our fence and the wall. The window was cracked open just enough to peer inside. I held my breath and slowly leaned forward, hoping I wouldn't be noticed. What I saw made my stomach turn. Through the small gap in the curtain, I could make out the dim shapes of the interior. The furniture was minimal, but what struck me most was the table in the center of the room. It was covered in something that looked like old papers, photographs, and stains. The dark, reddish-brown hue reminded me of something I had seen before, something I tried not to think about. Blood. I gasped, and my hand slipped from the window frame. My pulse raced, and I pulled back into the shadows, heart pounding in my ears. Was it real? Had I really seen that? I was almost certain I had. The feeling in my gut was undeniable, but I needed proof. I needed something that would convince me that my mind wasn't playing tricks on me. I waited. Minutes passed, maybe longer. I watched, but Lisa never came out. The wind rustled the trees, and the street seemed unusually quiet. I stood there, unable to tear my eyes away, my mind spinning with possibilities. What if I was right? What if she had been hiding something dangerous, this whole time? I didn't know what to do. But deep down, I knew one thing for certain, something was terribly wrong with Lisa. And whatever it wasn't over yet. The night felt heavier now, like the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths pressed down on my chest. I stood frozen, trying to catch my breath, but it was as if the world around me had slowed to a crawl. The small gap in the curtain burned into my mind, that image of the stained table still fresh in my thoughts. Was I imagining it? Or had I truly seen something that I couldn't explain away? I shook my head. I had to be sure. There were no lights flickering inside the house now. I waited, my eyes glued to the window, desperate for another glimpse. Was she still in there? Was she even home? The house felt eerily empty in the moonlight, like a hollow shell waiting to be disturbed. The minutes dragged on, but nothing moved. I knew it was risky, but I couldn't stop myself. I needed to find out what was going on. I couldn't leave it like this. I wasn't sure if I was more afraid of the truth or the idea that I might be wrong. I slowly crept toward the back of the house, avoiding the streetlights that could cast shadows over me. The soft crunch of gravel under my shoes sounded unnervingly loud in the stillness. At the back, I knew there was a small wooden door that led into her garden. It was rarely locked, and I had seen her slip in and out of it a few times. I pulled at the door. It creaked but opened, just as I had expected. The dim light of the street lamps filtered through the garden, casting long shadows against the overgrown bushes. The air was damp, thick with the scent of earth and old leaves. I took a deep breath, fighting the urge to turn back. There was something in my gut telling me this was a bad idea, that I was getting myself tangled in something far worse than I could handle. But the thought of what I had seen, the stains, the whispers of something darker, kept me moving forward. I reached the window at the back of the house, the one that led directly into the living room. It was covered by flimsy, yellowing curtains, but I could still make out the faint shapes inside. I crouched down, peering through the small crack. What I saw this time was worse. The room was different now. The table was gone, but the papers were still scattered across the floor. The dim light revealed strange, twisted shapes. Some looked like photographs, while others seemed to be drawings, rough, crude sketches of faces I didn't recognize. They were all drawn in a rushed, jagged manner, like someone desperate to get the images out of their head. I leaned in closer, my breath catching in my throat. The faces were distorted, twisted in ways that didn't seem natural. Some had eyes too big, others were missing entirely. I shuddered, feeling a cold sweat break out across my forehead. Suddenly, a movement. I pulled back instinctively, heart pounding in my chest. Was someone coming? Had she heard me? No. It was just a shadow, nothing more. But the sound, faint as it was, made me freeze again. A soft tapping, like fingernails tapping against glass. I didn't dare move. The tapping continued, rhythmic and slow. It grew louder. I could hear it distinctly now, coming from inside the house. It wasn't just a random noise. It was purposeful. The tap, 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 echoing in the silence. I felt my stomach turn. What was she doing in there? I needed to move. I couldn't just stand there, watching, listening to those sounds. My hands were shaking as I stood up, trying to back away without making a sound. But as I turned toward the garden path, something caught my eye. A figure. It was standing just behind me, barely visible in the dim light. My breath caught in my throat. I froze, my pulse racing, and my mind scrambled for an explanation. Lisa? I whispered, my voice hoarse. There was no answer, only silence. But I could feel the presence of someone, something, there, just beyond the shadows. I slowly turned, every muscle in my body screaming at me to run, but I couldn't. I had to know. I had to confront her. But when I looked closer, I saw it wasn't Lisa at all. It was someone else. A figure, tall and gaunt, draped in a dark, tattered coat. They stood motionless, their face hidden beneath the hood. I couldn't make out any features, just the faint outline of a head and shoulders. The figure took a step forward. Just one step. And then another. I backed up, my heart hammering in my chest, every instinct telling me to get out of there. I turned to flee, but my foot caught on a stone, and I stumbled to the ground. The figure stopped, watching me. I could feel their eyes on me, even though I couldn't see them. I had to get away. I scrambled to my feet and bolted down the path, not daring to look back. The house loomed behind me, silent once again. But the figure remained, as though it had never moved at all. By the time I reached my front door, my legs were shaking and my hands were cold. I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it. I leaned against it, trying to steady my breath. What had I just seen? I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, just fear messing with me. But deep down, I knew the truth. There was something in that house. Something I wasn't supposed to know. And whatever it wasn't just Lisa. I couldn't stop thinking about it. The tapping, the drawings, the figure. But there was one thought that haunted me more than anything else. Who had I seen in that window? I couldn't sleep that night. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling against the windows, set my heart racing. I sat in the dark, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what I had seen. The figure, the tapping, that thing in the garden. It felt like my mind was playing tricks on me, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something sinister was unfolding right under my nose. I had no solid proof, no concrete evidence, just a growing, gnawing fear that something was horribly wrong. I needed to know more about Lisa. I needed to understand what I was dealing with. The following morning, I forced myself to go outside, though every step felt like a battle. The sun was bright, almost too bright, and I hoped that the daylight would offer some comfort, some clarity, but deep down, I knew it wouldn't. The air was crisp, and the neighborhood looked the same as it always did, with the occasional bird chirping and the rustling of leaves in the trees. It was all so normal, so ordinary, but I couldn't shake the weight of last night. I walked across the street and stood in front of Lisa's house. It looked completely unchanged, as though nothing had happened. The curtains were drawn tightly again, blocking out any hint of activity inside. But I couldn't forget that image of the strange, shadowy figure in the garden. I couldn't forget the tapping. I couldn't forget the drawing. I walked to the front door. The steps creaked under my feet as I climbed the porch. I reached for the doorbell but hesitated. What was I even going to say? What would I ask her? There was no point in pretending everything was fine. But I couldn't just knock and ask her what was going on. I was already on edge, and confronting her might only make things worse. Instead, I stepped back and circled to the side of the house. There, hidden behind a large hedge, was a small window just beneath the roof. It wasn't a window that would be easy to spot from the street, but I knew from my previous spying that it was connected to a small room on the upper floor, probably her bedroom. I crouched low, careful not to make a sound, and peered through the glass. For a moment, there was nothing but shadowed emptiness. The blinds were drawn, but I could see faint outlines of furniture. A dresser, a chair, and then something moved. My heart stopped. There, in the faintest sliver of the room, I saw it again. The figure. A shadow, not fully formed but unmistakably there. It was standing near the bed, its presence thick, almost suffocating. And there it was again, the sound of tapping, like nails on wood. I swallowed hard, a cold shiver creeping down my spine. I had to know more. I had to understand what this was, why it was happening. I crept around the house, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The whole time, the feeling that I was being watched, that I wasn't alone, gnawed at me. When I reached the back of the house, I saw the garden door again. This time, it was slightly ajar. A bad decision, I told myself. A stupid decision. But my legs moved on their own, and before I could stop myself, I pushed the door open and slipped inside. The garden was eerily still. The wind had died down, leaving a heavy, thick silence in its wake. The air smelled damp, almost musty, as if the earth had absorbed too many secrets. The faint echo of footsteps sounded in my mind as I stepped across the garden toward the small back window I had seen earlier. There was no turning back. I knelt down and, as quietly as possible, pressed my eye to the glass. I could see the faint reflection of the curtains moving ever so slightly, like the slightest shift in the air. But something was different. The drawing on the floor from the night before, it was gone. In its place were more photographs. Strange, blurry pictures that looked like they had been taken from far away, and yet some of them felt too familiar. One photo stood out. It was of a man standing alone in a dimly lit hallway. His face was obscured, but there was something about the way he stood, rigid, almost unnatural. He was staring directly at the camera, or at least it seemed like he was. My breath caught in my throat. The photo was so clear, but it felt so wrong. I needed to leave. I had seen enough. But as I turned to crawl away, something caught my movement, a faint shadow shifting through the curtains. A figure, tall and thin, crossing the room. My blood ran cold. Was she watching me? I froze, my body paralyzed with fear. For a long moment, everything was silent. Too silent. And then, the door behind me creaked open. I whipped around, eyes wide, heart racing. There, standing at the edge of the garden, was Lisa. Her expression was unreadable, distant, as if she had known I would be there. The weight of her gaze felt like a physical force, pushing down on me. My mouth went dry, and for a moment, I could only stare back. She took a slow step forward, her eyes never leaving mine. "You've been looking, haven't you?" she said, her voice soft but chilling. I took a step back, but my feet were frozen, unable to move. "Why are you here?" she asked, her tone suddenly sharper. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. The silence between us stretched, thick and suffocating, and then she took another step forward. It wasn't just her presence anymore. It was the overwhelming sense that I was being pulled into something much deeper, something dark and inescapable. "I didn't want you to find out," she whispered. Before I could react, she turned and walked back toward the door of the house, leaving me standing in the garden, frozen in place. I stood there, motionless, my heart pounding in my chest. The garden was silent again, but the weight of Lisa's words hung in the air like a dense fog. "I didn't want you to find out." What was it that I had discovered? What was she hiding? I blinked rapidly, trying to force my body into action, but it felt as though the ground beneath me had turned to quicksand. I could still hear the echo of her voice, soft and unnerving. I glanced back at the house, the curtains now eerily still, as though the whole place had exhaled and was holding its breath. I took one hesitant step forward, then another. My mind raced with 1,000 questions. What did she mean? Why had she watched me, waited for me to come to the garden? And those photographs, what were they? Why did they feel so familiar? I had to know. I couldn't back away now. I moved quickly to the back door, but as I reached for the handle, it suddenly swung open, revealing Lisa standing in the doorway, her face shadowed by the dim light inside. "I didn't think you'd come back," she said, her voice a strange mix of relief and tension. Her eyes were still unreadable, and there was a faint, almost imperceptible quiver to her lips. "I need to know," I managed to say, my voice low and shaky. "What is going on here? What are you hiding?" Her eyes flicked down for a moment as though weighing her response. Then she stepped aside, silently motioning for me to enter. "Come in," she said softly. The air inside the house felt thick, almost stifling, as though it had been sealed away for far too long. The walls, once familiar and comforting, now seemed oppressive. The furniture, the pictures, even the smell of the room felt distorted, like something out of a dream. Lisa led me through the narrow hallway to a door at the end. The door to her bedroom. My pulse quickened. I had already seen glimpses of it through the small window, but standing before it now, everything felt different. "Sit," she instructed, motioning to the chair by the bed. I hesitated, but obeyed. My hands trembled in my lap as I waited. "I didn't want anyone to know," she said, her back turned as she began rummaging through a drawer beside the bed. But I see you've already uncovered something. She pulled out a thick, leather-bound book, its surface worn and cracked from age. I stared at the book, like a tightening. She set it on the bed between us. "This is my family's secret," she said quietly, her voice low but firm. "It's why I keep to myself. Why I stay inside at night. Why I've been avoiding you." I swallowed hard, not daring to speak. Lisa opened the book, flipping through pages that were filled with strange symbols, faded photographs, and what appeared to be notes in a language I couldn't understand. Some of the pictures were old, black and white images of people I didn't recognize, standing together in front of dark, foreboding buildings. But one of the photos sent a chill down my spine. It was a photo of a woman standing in front of a house. The same house I was sitting in right now. But it was different then, darker, older. And the woman in the photo had a look of such sadness in her eyes, it felt like she was staring directly into my soul. "That woman," Lisa whispered, as if sensing my thoughts. "She's my great-grandmother. Her name was Miriam. And this house, it's been in my family for generations. It's not just a house." She paused, as if gathering the strength to continue. "It's tied to something older. Something dangerous." I leaned forward, unable to stop myself. "What do you mean? What is this place?" Lisa hesitated, glancing at the photograph before turning her gaze back to me. "My great-grandmother made a deal with something. A being, not human. Something that lives in the dark corners of this house. It gives power, but at a cost." She closed the book, her fingers lingering on the cover. "I didn't know about this when I moved in. I thought the house was just old. But when I got here, strange things started happening. Things I couldn't explain. And then I found out the truth." I leaned back in my chair, trying to process her words. "What sort of things?" I asked, my voice trembling. "The tapping," she said, her eyes narrowing. "It's a signal. A warning. When you hear it, it means the entity is near. It's trying to get out." She took a deep breath, her voice faltering slightly. "The thing in the garden? That's where it tries to break free. It feeds on fear. And once it's free, it won't stop." I stared at her, unable to look away. "What are you telling me? Is it?" Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from somewhere downstairs, followed by a sound that made my blood run cold, a faint tapping. It came from the walls, the floor, the ceiling, all around us. I shot to my feet, my heart racing. The tapping grew louder, faster. I could feel the room shifting, the air thickening, as though something was closing in on us. Lisa's face went pale. "It's here," she whispered. Before I could say anything, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, but it was too late. The room was plunged into darkness, the only sound the tapping, now deafening, overwhelming. And then, nothing. I was no longer in the room with Lisa. I was in another place entirely. I couldn't breathe. The walls had closed in on me, their once familiar contours now contorted and unfamiliar. The darkness wasn't just an absence of light, it felt alive, thick with something I couldn't see but could feel pressing in on me from all sides. My heart raced in my chest, my limbs frozen as if the air itself had turned to quicksand. The tapping stopped. But the silence that followed wasn't comforting. It was heavy, suffocating. My eyes strained, trying to make sense of the void that surrounded me. I couldn't see anything. The room, no, this place, was no longer the small bedroom I had been in. There were no windows, no furniture. Just shadows. Deep, unsettling shadows that seemed to shift and slither as if they were breathing with me. I reached out, my hand trembling as it scraped against something cold. The surface was smooth, hard, like stone. I drew a sharp breath, trying to steady myself, but it was as if my own breath was stolen away by the air itself. I spun around, desperately trying to find some kind of exit, but there was nothing, just endless darkness. Then I heard it again. The tapping. It was soft at first, just a faint rhythm, like fingers against wood. But it grew louder, closer, and my mind began to race. No, it couldn't be. I remembered Lisa's words. The tapping was a warning. A sign that the thing, whatever it was near. I reached into my pocket, my hand brushing the familiar shape of my phone. With trembling fingers, I fumbled for the flashlight. It flickered to life, casting a weak beam of light across the vast, empty space. The shadows shifted in response, stretching and twisting as though trying to escape the light. My breath quickened. I had to find my way out. But where? Where was the door? Where was Lisa? Suddenly, a figure appeared in the distance, a dark silhouette, barely distinguishable from the surrounding shadows. I froze. My pulse thudded in my ears, but I couldn't tear my gaze away. The figure was moving, slowly, deliberately. I forced myself to take a step forward. Lisa? My voice was barely a whisper, drowned out by the oppressive silence. The figure didn't respond. It just continued its slow, steady approach. The closer it got, the more I could see the silhouette of a woman, her features blurred and indistinct. But there was something wrong. Her movements were jerky, unnatural. Almost as if she were being pulled, dragged along, rather than walking. I wanted to turn and run, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. Fear gripped me, a cold, suffocating hand that squeezed my chest. Lisa? I repeated, but my voice cracked, barely audible in the dark expanse. The figure didn't stop. It came closer, closer, until I could see the pale, lifeless skin stretched taut over her bones. Her eyes were black, hollow voids that seemed to absorb the light, and her lips were stretched into a grotesque smile, too wide to be human. I staggered back, my heart hammering against my ribs, but there was nowhere to go. The darkness seemed to close in around me, suffocating and impenetrable. And then, her voice, soft, barely a whisper, slithered through the air. You should never have come here. The words were filled with a dreadful finality. I could feel them in my bones, vibrating in the very air around me. Her gaze never wavered, her smile never faltered. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. It was as though my voice had been stolen, as though the very act of trying to resist had drained my strength. The tapping grew louder again, faster now, almost frantic, like a countdown. The sound seemed to reverberate from all directions, coming from within the walls, from beneath the floor, from everywhere. The figure took a step closer, her smile widening, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too many. The air thickened, swirling with an unnatural chill. I wanted to run. I needed to run. But my legs refused to move. It was as if I were rooted to the spot, frozen in place by her presence. Please, I whispered, my voice weak and broken. What do you want from me? She tilted her head slightly, as though considering the question. Then, her smile disappeared, replaced by an expression so cold, so empty, that it felt like I was staring into the void itself. "I don't want anything," she said, her voice distant, like it was coming from far away. "But the thing behind the walls, it does." I flinched, my heart skipping a beat. What do you mean?" Her face twisted into something that was almost a snarl, but it didn't seem to belong to her. "The house," she whispered, her voice trembling with something I couldn't place. "It's hungry. It feeds on fear, and now it's too late for you." Before I could react, the shadows surged forward, swallowing her whole. In an instant, she was gone, leaving only the sound of her fading laughter echoing in the void. The tapping grew louder still, now frenzied, frantic. It was coming for me. I had no choice. I had to escape. I wasn't going to let whatever it was take me. I ran. My legs finally obeyed, and I bolted forward, through the dark, heart pounding. But no matter how fast I moved, no matter how much I tried to call for help, the darkness closed in and the tapping followed, relentless, inevitable. And then, just as I thought I couldn't go any farther, I saw it. A faint sliver of light, barely visible through the oppressive dark. A door. I reached for it, desperate. But as my hand touched the handle, something seized my ankle, dragging me back. I screamed, but the sound was muffled, as if the darkness itself was swallowing my voice. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the faint glow of the door and the cold, lifeless eyes of the woman who had once been Lisa. And then, nothing. It's always the silence that makes you wonder. When things go quiet, that's when you start asking questions. But how do you ask about something you can't explain? I had lived in this building for 3 years, and I thought I knew every creak and groan it made. The old wooden floors, the rusted pipes, the faint hum of the refrigerator in the neighbor's apartment next door. It was a place that felt normal, nothing special, nothing extraordinary. But there was always something off about it. It was late when it first happened. I was in my apartment, sitting on the couch, the sound of my TV buzzing in the background. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows, but nothing too alarming. A typical stormy evening in the city. Then, I heard it. A soft scraping noise, like the dragging of a heavy object across the floor. I froze, my hand still gripping the remote, the noise cutting through the air like a knife. At first, I thought it was just the wind, something creaking from the storm. But no, this sound wasn't like that. It was deliberate. It came from the stairwell, just outside my door. I hesitated for a moment, waiting to see if it would stop. When it didn't, I stood up slowly, walking toward the door. I pressed my ear to the cold wood, straining to hear, but there was nothing. The scraping had stopped, leaving behind only a heavy silence. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks. After all, the building was old, there were always odd noises. But something about this one made my skin prickle. I went back to the couch, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in my chest. The storm raged outside, and I told myself that was the real cause of the tension in the air. Yet, as I sank back into the couch, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. For a few minutes, everything was still again. The TV played on in the background, a familiar hum that usually made me feel safe. But tonight, it felt distant, as if I wasn't really in my apartment at all. A knock. It was sharp and sudden. I almost jumped out of my skin, but before I could react, it came again, 3 quick knocks, followed by a long pause. I stood frozen in place, not knowing what to do. I glanced around the room, unsure of what to make of the situation. I wasn't expecting anyone. The neighbors weren't known for visiting at this hour, and there were no deliveries I had ordered. I considered ignoring it. But then I realized I could see no shadow under my door. No sign of anyone standing outside. Still, the knocking continued. The same rhythm, the same unsettling pattern. I wasn't sure what to do, but I found myself moving toward the door. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle, wondering who would be there and why I hadn't heard any footsteps leading up to my apartment. Just as my fingers touched the door, the knocking stopped. I stood there, heart pounding, staring at the door. Maybe it's nothing, I whispered to myself, trying to rationalize what was happening. But the unease wouldn't leave me. I opened the door. Nothing. The stairwell was empty, dark, and silent. No one was there. But as I stepped into the hallway, I noticed something strange. The air felt heavier, almost suffocating, as if the building itself were holding its breath. The faint smell of something metallic lingered in the air, like rust or old iron. It was so subtle, I could almost convince myself it was just a trick of my senses. I stepped back, closing the door quickly behind me. I leaned against it, still trying to gather my thoughts. But then I heard something else. The sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps, coming from the stairwell below. I didn't move. My heart was in my throat, every instinct screaming at me to leave the building, to run. But I stayed frozen, listening as the steps continued upward, slowly, one after another. Who was that? I peeked through the peephole, trying to see if anyone was there. There was no one. I opened the door slightly, just enough to peek into the dimly lit hallway, but the footsteps had stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. It felt oppressive, like the very air was waiting for something to happen. The thought crossed my mind that maybe it was a neighbor, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized I hadn't seen anyone in the hallway all night. No one had come or gone. I closed the door again, locking it tightly, but the feeling of unease only grew stronger. I sat back down on the couch, my eyes darting to the window where the storm still raged. But the tapping at the door had left an imprint in my mind. Something wasn't right. I glanced over at the clock. It was past midnight now, but I couldn't bring myself to sleep. Every creak of the building seemed louder now. Every shift in the wind, every rustle of leaves outside, felt magnified. And then the doorbell rang. The bell rang again, sharp and insistent. I froze, my heart racing, my breath caught in my throat. The sound was jarring against the deep silence of the apartment, as though the world had stopped, holding its breath in anticipation. Who could be at the door? No one else lived on this floor. Everyone in the building knew the rules. Don't knock late at night, don't disturb others unless it's an emergency. But there it was again, the bell, persistent, almost demanding attention. I stood motionless for a moment, my mind struggling to make sense of it. Was I imagining this? Maybe I had fallen asleep on the couch and was dreaming. But the cold chill that ran through my body told me this wasn't a dream. I glanced over at the peephole again. This time, I expected to see someone, perhaps a neighbor who had forgotten something, maybe a visitor. But the hallway outside was as dark and empty as before. No shadow, no figure. Just the dull glow from the stairwell lights flickering, casting long shadows that stretched across the walls. My breath quickened. The ringing stopped. The silence that followed was unnerving, so complete that I could almost hear my pulse hammering in my ears. I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting. Maybe it was someone who had just missed the timing of the bell. Maybe they were standing out of view or had moved out of range. But why would they ring again and then leave so quickly? And why hadn't I heard the footsteps this time? I swallowed hard, struggling to calm my nerves. Something in the back of my mind whispered that I needed to check the hallway again, that maybe I had missed something. I stood up slowly, each movement deliberate, and approached the door. Just as I reached for the handle, the bell rang again, this time louder, more insistent, almost as if it were mocking me. I jerked back, feeling my stomach twist. I could feel the sweat forming on my palms as I clenched the doorknob tightly. My mind raced, and for a fleeting moment, I thought about not answering. But the curiosity, the need to understand what was happening, drove me forward. I opened the door a crack, just enough to peer into the hallway once more. Nothing. No one was there. But then, I noticed something odd. The air was heavier, colder, and the faint metallic smell I had noticed earlier was stronger now. It was almost suffocating. The hallway light flickered again, and I saw something at the far end of the corridor, movement, a figure, or at least the shape of something shifting. I blinked, trying to adjust my eyes to the dim light. For a moment, I thought I saw someone standing at the edge of the stairwell. A figure in dark clothing, too still to be a person. But when I looked again, it was gone. Just the shadows, stretching and distorting in the dim light. My heart raced, but I couldn't move. I wanted to scream, to shout out, but no sound came from my throat. It felt as though the very air around me had thickened, pressing in, making it harder to breathe. Then, from somewhere deep within the building, I heard it, a low, almost imperceptible groan. The sound of wood bending, of something heavy scraping against the floor. It wasn't coming from my apartment. It was coming from below, from the stairwell. I stepped back quickly, closing the door as quietly as I could. I stood there, pressed against the door, my heart thudding in my chest. What the hell was going on? The groaning sound intensified, followed by a soft, dragging sound. It was unmistakable now. Someone or something was moving in the stairwell. But I hadn't seen anyone when I peeked through the peephole, and the hallway was still empty when I opened the door. A chill ran down my spine as I slowly backed away from the door, my mind racing with possibilities. Maybe it was one of the other residents, acting strangely, or maybe something was happening in the building that I just didn't understand. But deep down, a more sinister thought crept in. What if it wasn't anyone at all? What if whatever was in the stairwell wasn't human? The scraping continued. Closer now. Step by step, the sound grew louder. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't wait to see what would happen next. My instinct screamed at me to leave, to run, to get out of the building before whatever this was reached me. But where would I go? I grabbed my phone from the coffee table and tried to call the landlord, but there was no answer. No surprise there. He was always unreachable after hours. Then, the dragging stopped. The silence returned, but it wasn't peaceful. It was worse than before, unnerving, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. I turned toward the window, half expecting to see someone watching me from outside, but the storm had died down. The street below was dark and empty, bathed in the eerie glow of the streetlights. The sound came again, a creaking from the stairwell. It was louder now, closer. I was sure that whoever, or whatever, was down there, it was right below me, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my coat, my heart pounding, and rushed to the door. As I opened it, I heard the unmistakable sound of a door creaking from a neighboring apartment. But no one was there. I slammed the door shut behind me, my heart racing like a drumbeat. I had no clear plan, no idea where I was going or what I was doing. My only instinct was to get away from the eerie silence, away from the thing, whatever it was, that was lurking just beyond my door. I rushed toward the stairs, my footsteps echoing off the walls of the narrow, dimly lit hallway. The feeling of being watched only intensified as I descended each step, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up straight. I had always lived in this building, and the familiar creak of the wooden stairs under my feet was a small comfort. But now, every noise felt exaggerated, as though the whole place was closing in around me. The walls seemed to be moving in, the air felt thick with tension. I reached the bottom floor, expecting to find the lobby as empty and quiet as usual. But when I pushed open the door, I was greeted by a strange sight. The lobby was shrouded in darkness. The lights, usually buzzing faintly overhead, were off. Only the faint glow from the streetlight outside filtered in through the glass doors, casting long shadows that stretched across the floor. I wasn't sure what had triggered it. Perhaps it was the unsettling silence, or maybe the fact that the building now felt utterly abandoned, but I suddenly felt a strong compulsion to turn back. Just as I was about to retreat to the stairs, I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper. It was low, like the rustling of a leaf caught in the wind, but unmistakable. I froze, my breath hitching. The whisper seemed to come from somewhere within the lobby, just beyond the faint outlines of the chairs and the door to the janitor's closet. It wasn't clear at first, just a sound too soft to make out. But then, it became clearer. "Help me." The voice was almost a whisper, but there was a tremor in it, as though it were being muffled, smothered. The hairs on my arms stood up as I turned toward the source of the sound. "Who's there?" My voice sounded weak, a nervous tremor breaking through the usual steadiness. My mind scrambled for an explanation. Could it be one of the residents? Could someone be in trouble? No answer came, just a low hum that seemed to vibrate through the walls, resonating deep within my chest. I took a cautious step forward, inching closer to the door of the janitor's closet. The whisper grew louder, the words becoming more distinct. "Please, don't let it in." A cold chill ran through me, freezing my blood. Who was this? Why did they sound so desperate, so terrified? I took another step, my legs heavy as if they were made of stone. Every instinct told me to turn and run, but something held me there, tethering me to the floor. Another voice joined in, soft at first, almost like a second breath. "Get out." It was more of a growl than a whisper, low and guttural, the kind of sound that makes your stomach twist. The voices were overlapping now, blending into something darker, something more sinister. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The sound, the voices, were coming from everywhere at once, echoing in my mind as much as in the space around me. A sudden thought struck me. What if it was the people who had disappeared? What if this was how they had vanished, lost to some darkness that now reached out to claim anyone who ventured too close? I forced myself to take another step, then another. The air was thick with a suffocating weight, and each whisper seemed to close in around me like a vice. I finally reached the janitor's closet door, my hand trembling as I reached for the knob. But before I could turn it, the whispering stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of my own rapid breathing. Then, a single, sharp noise cut through the silence, like a door slamming shut somewhere far off in the building. I whipped around, my heart hammering in my chest. But there was nothing. No one. The lobby was as empty as it had been moments before. A strange unease settled into the pit of my stomach. I wasn't sure if I had heard what I thought I had, or if it had all been my imagination running wild. My mind raced, trying to rationalize it. The building was old, things creaked, the wind could do strange things. But this felt different, too deliberate, too calculated. The hairs on my neck stood up once again as I turned back toward the stairs, my feet light and quick as I ascended to the next floor. I needed to get back to my apartment, to lock the door, to escape whatever had been stirring in the building's depths. But just as I reached the landing, I heard something else. This time, it wasn't a whisper. It was a scream. A long, drawn-out cry that echoed through the walls of the stairwell. It was a sound that couldn't be ignored. A sound that made my blood run cold and my stomach drop. I rushed up the last flight of stairs, stumbling slightly, desperate to escape whatever nightmare was unfolding inside this building. But when I reached my apartment door, the sight before me stopped me dead in my tracks. The door was slightly ajar. My mind screamed in panic, but my body froze. I could feel the cold air pressing in on me, thick with the smell of something foul, something that didn't belong. I slowly pushed the door open, the creak of the hinges like a signal that something terrible had happened, something that I wasn't yet ready to face. The apartment was dark, unnaturally so. The faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock were gone, replaced by a suffocating silence. The floor was cold under my feet as I stepped inside, and the unsettling smell of rot filled my nostrils. And then, in the middle of the room, I saw it. A figure. A shadow. It wasn't a person. It was something else. I stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the shadow in the middle of the room. It wasn't moving, but it wasn't still either. There was something wrong about it, something so wrong that I couldn't even bring myself to step fully into the apartment. My heart pounded in my chest, echoing in my ears like the slow beat of a drum. The shadow wasn't shaped like a person, though it was the size of one. It loomed tall, too tall. Its edges weren't sharp, but soft, as if the darkness around it were liquid, dripping into the floor. It seemed to stretch and curl, an unnatural thing that didn't belong to the confines of a normal room. I took a hesitant step inside, my breath shallow. The air in the apartment was thick, like the weight of the space itself had changed. There was something suffocating about it, as if the very walls were pressing in. The smell was stronger now, that rot, that decay. It stung in the back of my throat. As I moved closer, the shadow began to shift. Slowly, at first, just a subtle twitch in the corner of my eye, the edges of the darkness curling toward the middle of the room. It was as if it had a life of its own, a consciousness. And then, with a soft, almost imperceptible hum, it moved. I gasped and took a step back, my foot catching the edge of the rug, sending me stumbling. The shadow didn't follow my movement, though. It just stayed there, as if waiting for me, for something. And that's when I noticed it. There was something inside the shadow. Or maybe it was part of the shadow, something darker, something more tangible. A figure, no, a face. I blinked, and it was gone. But the feeling lingered, that pressure in the air, that sense of being watched. I could still feel the weight of those unseen eyes, even though I couldn't see the face anymore. My head swam with panic, and I had to force myself to breathe. I tried to rationalize it. It was a trick of the light, a trick of my mind. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The apartment had always felt a little off. I've lived there long enough to know its sounds, its creaks and groans. But now, every sound seemed amplified. The walls seemed to groan in discomfort, the floor creaked under my weight like it was protesting my presence. I stepped further into the room, almost against my will, my feet dragging. The shadow remained still, but its presence felt more oppressive than ever. I could hear the faintest sound of breathing, low, guttural, like something was struggling to exhale. I had to get out. I had to leave. But when I turned to the door, it slammed shut behind me with an unnatural force. The loud bang reverberated in the room, and I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't breathe. Panic surged through me like a tidal wave. My thoughts raced. I tried the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. My fingers fumbled around it desperately, as though I could somehow force it open. But it was locked. Or worse, it wasn't just locked, it was sealed shut. Please, I whispered to the air, to the walls that seemed to pulse with something unseen. Please, let me out. The silence was suffocating. And then, from the corner of the room, I heard it. A soft rustle. A shift in the air. The shadow was moving again. I turned quickly, but it was too late. The darkness seemed to pulse toward me, an overwhelming force that threatened to engulf me whole. The edges of it blurred, and the air grew cold, colder than I had ever felt. I couldn't tell if it was the shadow closing in or if it was something else, something that had been waiting for me all along. The darkness seemed to devour everything around me. The walls, the furniture, everything was fading into the void, becoming a part of it. I couldn't scream. I couldn't even move. My legs felt like they were made of lead, and the cold that surrounded me was so intense it felt like my very bones were freezing. And then, from the center of the shadow, a voice. Not a whisper this time. No, this was something deeper, more primal. You shouldn't have stayed. The words echoed in my head, reverberating like a bell, louder and louder until I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. It was all-consuming. I tried to turn away, but my body wouldn't respond. My legs wouldn't obey. I felt paralyzed, my limbs stiff and heavy. I was trapped, caught in this web of darkness, unable to escape. The voice, now familiar and taunting, grew louder, clearer. You've seen too much. And then, like a snap of a thread, everything went still. The shadow stopped moving. The air cleared. The apartment was normal again, almost too normal. The oppressive weight of the darkness had lifted, leaving only the faint scent of dust and the ordinary silence of an empty room. But I knew better now. I wasn't alone. Not anymore. The apartment was silent. Too silent. My breath echoed, ragged, in the stillness. I hadn't realized how tightly my chest had been constricted until the pressure loosened. The darkness had lifted, but only for a moment. I could still feel the cold, like fingers of ice, brushing the nape of my neck. I backed away from the center of the room, my feet stumbling over the floorboards, still unsure if my body was fully mine. Every step I took seemed to sound louder than it should have, each movement growing more unnatural in the eerie stillness. The apartment looked the same, yet it felt different. As if it had been altered, reshaped into something new, and now I was nothing more than a stranger wandering through it. But there was one thing I knew for sure now. I wasn't alone. The thought struck me like a cold slap to the face. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, lingering in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. I glanced toward the hallway, my gaze darting around, but I didn't dare leave the room. Not yet. The door was still sealed, its edges no longer giving even the smallest indication of a latch. It was as if it had become part of the wall, bound by some force stronger than the simple wood and metal it had once been. I tried the handle again, desperate, but it was no use. The weight of the room seemed to press in on me as if every corner had become suffocating. I couldn't escape. It was like the walls were moving in, breathing, pulsing. I could feel the apartment shifting underfoot, like it was alive. Why? I whispered to myself, the word more of a question than a statement. Why is this happening? I didn't expect an answer. And then, as if to answer anyway, I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, footsteps. They were faint at first, as if someone were walking in the next room, or maybe even on the floor above. I froze, listening intently. The steps stopped. I waited for a beat, maybe two, and then, from behind me, a faint rustle. I spun around, hard hammering, but the room was empty. Empty, except for the shadows. They were no longer confined to a single corner. No, they seemed to be spreading, pooling like oil on water, creeping over the floor and crawling up the walls. They moved without reason, without pattern, as if the very space was becoming consumed by them. And then, there it was again. A soft, dry chuckle. It wasn't human. It couldn't have been. I stumbled backward, tripping over a chair and falling hard onto the floor. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I thought I might pass out. But I couldn't. Not now. Not while I was so close to unraveling everything. The laughter echoed again, this time louder, closer. My chest tightened, and I could feel my pulse in my throat. The fear was suffocating. It wasn't just the apartment anymore, it was the air, the walls, the very place I stood. Every inch of this building was infected with it, with the thing I had felt, the thing that had been waiting. I crawled across the floor, trying to make my way to the door, to the hallway, to anywhere but here. But I was moving too slowly. The shadows seemed to close in on me, the darkness wrapping tighter around my legs, my body, pulling me back into the center of the room. I tried to scream, but my voice was lost in the thick air. I felt as if I were drowning, suffocating in the very place that had once felt like home. There was a figure now, a shape, dark against the blackness, standing just at the edge of the room. It was tall, too tall, and its shape was distorted, warping like melted wax. I couldn't make out its features, but I could feel its gaze, its presence, like it was drawing me in. No! I gasped, scrambling backward. The figure didn't move. It didn't need to. The darkness surged forward with frightening speed. In an instant, the air was cold, so cold that I couldn't breathe. I felt my skin prickling with 1,000 tiny needles. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything, but I couldn't. And then, in the distance, the sound of the door creaking open. I couldn't believe it. I spun around, desperate to get out, but I couldn't see the doorway anymore. It was there, yet it felt like miles away. My legs shook, my body trembling, but somehow I managed to pull myself toward it. My hand reached for the doorframe, fingers brushing against the cool wood, and I pushed myself through the opening. For a split second, I thought I had made it. But then, I looked behind me. The apartment was gone. The hallway, the staircase, it was all gone. The shadows had swallowed them whole. The only thing that remained was a thick, suffocating fog. The walls, the ceiling, the very ground under my feet, all seemed to blur into one endless expanse. I turned back to face what was behind me. The figure, the shadow, was still there, watching me from within the fog, its dark shape looming like a storm cloud. It hadn't moved, but I could feel its eyes boring into me. A part of me knew it wouldn't let me go. Not now. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was a part of this place, a part of me now. I wasn't going to escape. The last thing I heard before everything went dark was the sound of laughter. The sound of my own voice, mocking me. And then, nothing. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.